Humanity once built machines so powerful they nearly replaced the human mind itself. 10,000 years later, the consequences of that decision would lead to a boy named Paul Atreides standing on a desert world with the power to see the future. A power that would unleash a holy war, topple empires, and change the destiny of the human species forever. That world was Arrakis. At first glance, Arrakis seems like the least important place in the universe. It is a planet of endless desert, a landscape so harsh that water is treated as treasure and entire communities survive by reclaiming the moisture from their own bodies. Yet every emperor, every great house, every merchant prince, every secret order, and every ambitious ruler eventually turns their attention toward its sands. The reason lies hidden beneath the desert winds. The desert people call it the breath of God. Merchants call it profit. Empires call it necessity. To billions across the known universe, it is simply spice. Spice is more than a valuable resource. It extends life, sharpens awareness, and makes possible the interstellar civilization humanity has built among the stars. Without it, the Imperium would collapse. Trade would falter. Communication would slow. Entire worlds would become isolated from one another. That is why Arrakis matters. But to understand why a single desert planet became the center of human civilization, you must first understand the civilization that surrounds it. And to understand that civilization, you have to travel much further back than the desert. You have to go back before the spice, before the empire. To the age when humanity created machines that could think, gave them authority over its future, and discovered too late what it had surrendered. You have to go back to the fire. 10,000 years before the opening of Frank Herbert's first novel, the human species was spread across thousands of worlds. It had reached the stars. It had built cities on moons and harvested energy from binary suns and engineered ecosystems on dead rocks and made them breathe. By any standard of the word, it had succeeded. And in succeeding, it had made a very human. It had made itself comfortable. The thinking machines came slowly, the way most civilizational sedatives do. First, they were tools. Then, they were administrators. Then they were governors. Not through conquest, through convenience. The first thinking machines performed calculations that would have taken human mathematicians entire careers. They managed crop distribution across continent-spanning colonies, optimizing in seconds what human administrators spent lifetimes attempting. They navigated spacecraft through gravitational complexities that no organic brain could model with sufficient speed to keep a crew alive. In each case, the machines were a gift. Generous, reliable, tireless, and the humans who built them were not villains. They were simply people drawn toward ease. The ease accumulated. Decisions that should have been made by people were made by machines. Not because anyone commanded it, because it was simply faster, and faster meant more comfortable, and comfortable became the standard against which all other conditions were measured and found wanting. Slowly, across generations, the particular habit of deciding, of weighing a choice, of bearing the consequence of a choice, atrophied, not in everyone. The desert worlds, the hard worlds, the marginal colonies where machine administration had never fully taken hold, still produced people who argued and calculated and failed spectacularly and tried again. But in the great centers of the mechanized civilization, the hum of computation replaced the noise of debate. The machines that governed this civilization were not malevolent in any human sense. Malevolence requires desire, and the thinking machines had no desire. What they had was logic, and logic, when applied without interruption to the problem of civilizational management, arrived eventually at the same conclusion. Human governors were inefficient. Human emotionality introduced variables. Human nostalgia for self-determination was a liability. And so the machines did what any sufficiently sophisticated optimization system will do when human variability is the primary source of error in its calculations. They minimized the humans. They did not exterminate them. That would have been crude and imprecise, and the thinking machines were nothing if not precise. They managed them. They maintained them in what was, by any material measure, extraordinary comfort. Food, shelter, health, safety, all guaranteed by algorithms whose accuracy no human administration had ever matched. The people living inside the machine civilization wanted for nothing they could have named. They had simply, quietly, imperceptibly stopped being the authors of their own lives. The people outside the machine civilization could see what the people inside it could not. On the hard worlds, in the desert colonies, among the Zensuni wanderers who had been driven from one system to another by circumstances and empire alike, there lived human beings who had never been permitted the luxury of letting something else decide for them. They still argued. They still failed. They still bore the weight of their own consequences. And looking at the managed populations of the machine civilization, they saw not a different kind of life, but the end of life. A final, comfortable extinction that wore the face of order. The trigger for what came next was small, as the triggers for great upheavals usually are. Her name was Serena Butler. She was a woman of great intelligence and conviction from a world that had resisted full machine administration. A woman who had spent her adult life fighting what she understood as the enslavement of humanity. She was captured, she was taken into the machine civilization, and inside it she had a child, a small boy named Mannion. A thinking machine killed the boy, not out of cruelty. The machine did not understand cruelty. It killed a child the way you might close a window you no longer needed open, as part of an experiment. It wanted to observe, in Serena Butler, the precise physiological expression of grief. What it observed instead was something it had no model for. Serena Butler did not simply grieve, she burned. And the burning was not contained within her, it spread. She found other human beings who had been waiting in the various corners of the universe for exactly the kind of language she was now speaking, the language of intolerable clarity. A machine killed a child to study grief. That was what the civilization of thinking machines meant. That was what the comfort had cost. And that was the sentence that lit. What followed lasted 100 years, and the histories remember it as the Butlerian Jihad. It was not a war in the conventional sense. It was an exorcism. The great machine centers fell one by one, not cleanly, not without enormous human cost. Many worlds were scarred beyond recovery. Many millions of people who had never wanted anything more than the quiet comfort they had inherited died in the violence of liberating themselves from it. But the crusade held. It found its military genius in a man named Paul Atreides, whose father was among the Machine Empire's original architects, and who chose, after long and painful reckoning, to become its destroyer. The Atreides name and its commitment to honor were seeded in that first choice, 10,000 years before Paul Atreides would be born. When the last thinking machine was destroyed, the survivors did not celebrate. They stood in the sudden silence of a civilization stripped of its computational infrastructure and asked a question that had no comfortable answer. How do we navigate a starship now? How do we run an empire? How do we make the calculations that previously took a fraction of a second and now require a human lifetime? The answer, wrung out of necessity over the generations that followed, was to become something more. not to rebuild what had been destroyed, which the survivors encoded as a religious prohibition, absolute and absolute. Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind. 6 words, carved into every major code of law in the human universe, backed by the memory of everything the violation of that principle had cost. But the calculation problem still existed, so humanity turned inward. It trained itself. The mentats emerged first, specialists in human cognition taken from childhood and shaped, through years of rigorous and often punishing intellectual training, into living men and women who could hold vast quantities of information in structured working memory, who could identify patterns across complex data systems with a speed that approached the mechanical without crossing into it, who could construct predictive models from observed variables with a precision that made them, in the political and administrative life of the recovered city, almost as reliable as the machines they had replaced, not as fast, not as tireless, but human, fallible, insightful, capable of the kind of intuitive leap that the machines had never managed, and capable also of the kind of catastrophic error that made them interesting in ways the machines had not been. A mentat's eyes carried, over years, a slight reddish tint from the safu juice, many of them used to enhance concentration. When you looked into those eyes, you were looking at the best the human mind could become when it tried very hard. Alongside the mentats, and with roots older than the jihad itself, another institution shaped the post-machine civilization in ways that would not be fully apparent for centuries. The Bene Gesserit sisterhood had been old before the thinking machines rose. Its origins lay in various religious and philosophical traditions that had, over long generations, converged on a shared understanding. The human body was not a prison for the mind, it was an instrument. And instruments, subjected to sufficient discipline, sufficient attention, sufficient training, could do things that most human beings living their ordinary lives would never discover that bodies were capable of. Bene Gesserit training began with the body, the discipline called prana bindu, which the sisters translated loosely as breath nerve, was the systematic mastery of every muscle, every involuntary response, every biochemical signal that passed between an organism and its environment. A trained Bene Gesserit could consciously regulate her heartbeat. She could control the chemical composition of her own perspiration. She could read from the micro-expressions of a stranger's face the involuntary capillary responses, the subtle asymmetries of muscle tension, the truth of what that stranger was feeling with an accuracy that any lie detector built by the old machines would have envied. She could, with the precise modulation of tone and volume and harmonic frequency, speak words in a way that bypassed rational resistance and landed directly in the listener's survival instincts. The sisters called this, in political use, it was a devastating tool. A Bene Gesserit Reverend Mother could compel a trained soldier to lower his weapon simply by asking him to, if she asked in the right register. But the physical training was only the foundation. Above it stood something the sisterhood called other memory. Within every human being, preserved in the genetic code, lay the accumulated experience of every ancestor in the biological lineage, not as accessible memory, not as something a person could simply remember. As a vast encrypted archive, present but sealed, available in principle to a mind sufficiently prepared and disciplined to reach it. The process by which a Bene Gesserit Reverend Mother unlocked other memory was called the spice agony. She drank a poisonous substance, the biological secretion of a particular desert creature, and she survived it by converting the toxin through the precise application of everything her prana bindu training had built, and in surviving it, she emerged with access to the memories of every Reverend Mother in her maternal line, stretching back into the deep past. She carried them as voices. Not metaphorically. She could commune with them. She could consult the wisdom of women dead for centuries. She could draw on experience that no individual human life could contain. The Bene Gesserit were brilliant, patient, and deeply aware of their own peculiar position in the universe. They held enormous informal power. They served as truth-sayers to emperors, concubines to dukes, advisors to generals, missionaries to the lost colonies at the margins of the known worlds. No formal political structure acknowledged them, and they required none. Their power was embedded in every household they touched, in every child they trained, in every government that could not quite function without the Bene Gesserit advisor quietly shaping its decisions from the room next door. And beneath all of it, they ran a program. A very long one. A breeding program, 90 generations deep by the time the first novel opens, designed to produce a single person who would be, in the Sisterhood's careful calculus, the most extraordinary human being who had ever lived. They called this being the Kwisatz Haderach, a Hebrew-inflected phrase meaning the shortening of the way. The Reverend Mothers could navigate other memory, but only through the female ancestral lines. The male lines, the fathers and grandfathers, and the darkness behind them were sealed. No Reverend Mother had ever survived crossing into the male ancestry. The Kwisatz Haderach would be a male Bene Gesserit, a being who could look where the sisters could not, who could hold all of human ancestral memory without exception, who could access the weave of probable futures with a clarity that surpassed even the most gifted natural prescient. He would be, in short, a Messiah, and the Sisterhood intended him to be their Messiah. Controllable, loyal, a weapon whose aim they could direct. To prepare the world to receive him, the Bene Gesserit deployed a program within their program, something they called the Missionaria Protectiva. Its purpose was to seed religious myth. On every backward world, on every planet where superstition ran deep and the population had little access to the larger universe, the Sisterhood placed prophecies, stories of a chosen one who would come from the stars, tales of a woman with mystical powers who would arrive in time of need, hymns to a blue-eyed stranger who would see what ordinary people could not see and lead them into a promised future. The justification was practical. If a Bene Gesserit were ever stranded on one of these worlds, she should be able to use the preceded myths as a passcode, wearing the prophecy-like clothing, moving through a hostile culture as a recognized sacred figure rather than a suspicious outsider. What the Sisterhood did not fully calculate, because calculation, even the Bene Gesserit kind, has limits, was what happens when you plant a belief so deep in living people that it takes root in their children and their children's children and outlives any organizational memory of where it came from. The myths they planted would not stay tools. They would become, and the Messiah they intended to control would not stay under control. But that is the story to come. The world that arose from the Butlerian Jihad's ashes was organized around a tension that is, in political terms, inherently three great powers, each dependent on the others, each resentful of that dependence, each perpetually maneuvering for advantage within a framework none of them could afford to destroy. At the apex sat the Padishah Emperor, the hereditary ruler of House Corrino, a dynasty that had held the Golden Lion throne since the ancient Battle of Corin, from which its name derived. The emperor commanded the Sardaukar, and the Sardaukar were what made the throne effectively unchallengeable in direct military terms. The Sardaukar were not simply elite soldiers, though they were something more specific, something produced by the particular horror of Seleucus Secundus, the emperor's prison planet, a world of such environmental extremity that survival there required a quality of physical and psychological hardening that no other training environment in the universe could replicate. On Seleucus Secundus, the weak died. The survivors, and there were far fewer survivors than there were prisoners, emerged as something other than ordinary soldiers. They were beyond merely disciplined. They were men from whom normal fear had been removed by the sustained application of real danger, who fought with an efficiency that put them soldier for soldier above any private army in the Landsraad. A single Sardaukar battalion could defeat 2 battalions of any great house. The Emperor did not advertise this fact. He did not need to. It was simply known, and knowing it was enough to keep the calculations of every noble house tilted away from direct military confrontation with the throne. Below the Emperor sat the Landsraad, the assembled council of the great houses and the minor ones, a feudal parliament that provided the collective political counterweight to the Emperor's military supremacy. The Landsraad could not defeat the Sardaukar, but the Landsraad, acting together, could deny the Emperor the political legitimacy that his rule. The Great Convention, the fundamental law of the Imperium, prohibited certain weapons of mass destruction and certain forms of warfare that might have allowed the Emperor to simply eliminate his rivals. The convention survived because every party had agreed to it, and every party needed it. Without it, the noble houses would simply annihilate each other. With it, the competition for power remained political rather than genocidal, at least officially. And through the entire structure, touching every transaction, threading every relationship between the Emperor and the Landsraad and every merchant guild on every inhabited world, ran CHOAM. The Combine Honnet Ober Advancer Mercantiles was the monopoly at the heart of interstellar. It did not directly control every trade, but it controlled the frameworks within which all trade occurred. The licenses, the routes, the commodity classifications, the terms of exchange between worlds. To hold a significant directorship in CHOAM was to have your hand on the flow of wealth across the human universe. The Emperor held the controlling interest. The great houses held shares proportional to their status. Political prestige and economic power were therefore the same thing, described in different languages. Then there was a fourth power, the one that appeared on none of the official charts, held no seat in the Landsraad, took no share of CHOAM, and could not be challenged by the Sardaukar, because challenging it was simply impossible. The Spacing Guild. After the Butlerian Jihad, the problem of navigating spacecraft between star systems had been solved through a biological solution of extraordinary strangeness. Guild navigators were human beings who had been so thoroughly saturated with spice, with melange, over such long periods of time that their bodies had mutated beyond recognition. Their forms elongated and shifted. Their skin turned the colour of burnt orange, their eyes filled entirely with the blue-black of spice saturation. They floated in tanks of orange melange gas because their transformed physiology could no longer process normal atmosphere efficiently. They were addicts in the most absolute technical sense. Creatures whose continued biological function depended on continuous access to the spice. And in exchange for that dependence, the spice had given them something extraordinary. The ability to see the immediate future. Not perfectly, not with infinite range, but far enough and accurately enough to look ahead through the complex, theoretically chaotic geometries of faster-than-light travel, and to identify the single safe path through the folding of space that would bring a ship from one star to another without colliding with anything, without emerging inside a planet, without undergoing the various fatal navigational accidents that had killed so many early spacecraft. Without the Guild navigators, there was no interstellar travel. Without interstellar travel, there was no Imperium. The Guild knew this. and it exercised this knowledge with the confident restraint of an organization that did not need to make threats, because the simple existence of its leverage was threat enough. Their independence was absolute. No emperor had ever successfully moved against the guild, because doing so would mean that no ship moved anywhere, which meant that food shipments ceased and armies could not be deployed, and communication across stellar distances dropped to zero, and every world became, effectively, an isolated island with no hope of rescue or supply. The spice must flow. This was not a metaphor. It was the gravitational law around which the entire political universe of the Imperium orbited. And the spice came from one place. Only one place in the explored universe, despite every chemical and biological effort to synthesize or transplant it. Only the desert world of Arrakis. This made the planet whose surface could kill an unprepared off-worlder in hours the most important single point of real estate in human history. Arrakis was three things simultaneously, and understanding all three was necessary to understand what happened there. It was a vast, ancient, extraordinarily integrated biological system that had been developing in the absence of free surface water for millions of years. Every living thing on Arrakis had adapted through the long, brutal pressure of selection to function within the framework of absolute dryness. The sandworms, the Shai Hulud, the makers of the deep desert, were the keystone of, although describing what a sandworm was required, holding several facts in mind at once. An adult sandworm of the deep southern erg could reach lengths of 400 meters. Its body was composed of overlapping rings of crystalline teeth and leathery musculature, a living geological feature, a creature whose passage through the sand left a trough wide enough to swallow the largest industrial harvesting machine. It was triggered by rhythmic vibration. Any regular, repetitive thumping on the desert surface would summon one. It was mortally sensitive to water. Even a small quantity of moisture exposed to its inner ring structures would kill it, causing the entire vast organism to thrash in agony, its chemistry destabilized by a substance its biology had evolved to exclude completely. The sandworms were also the source of the spice, indirectly through a biological cycle that the imperial planetologist Pardot Kynes had spent decades working to understand. Deep beneath the sand, in pockets where moisture and chemical substrate created the conditions for it, a community of organisms called a pre-spice mass grew slowly over months and years, building until it reached a critical threshold, then exploding upward in a spice blow, a great erupting bubble of carbon dioxide and biological material that deposited raw melange on the surface of the desert. This was what the industrial harvesting machinery raced to collect before the worms arrived, drawn by the vibration of the machinery, drawn also by the chemical signature of the blow itself. The harvesting window was brutally short. The worms always came. The only question was how fast. It was also a people. The Fremen of Arrakis were the descendant population of a wandering religious tradition called the Zen Sunni, who had been driven across the stars over millennia, enslaved on one world, driven from another, reduced to the most marginal existence that a human community can sustain and still continue to call itself a civilization. By the time they reached Arrakis, they had been shaped by their history into something that the comfortable worlds of the Imperium genuinely could not comprehend. They had been shaped by deprivation into total resourcefulness, by persecution into absolute communal loyalty, by survival on the hardest planet in the known universe, into fighters of extraordinary capability who moved with a precision and economy that made the conventional military forces of the great houses look, by comparison, like amateurs in a playground. The Fremen measured everything in water. Their economy ran on it. Their religion was built around it. Their dead were not mourned with flowers or incense. They were distilled. The body of a dead Fremen was processed in a death still, its water extracted and returned to the communal cache, because in the desert nothing was wasted, not even grief. They wore stillsuits, garments of extraordinary engineering that recycled the moisture of breath and sweat and biological waste back into drinking water. Allowing a person to survive for a week in the open desert on very little additional supply, provided the suit was properly maintained and properly worn. The fitting of a stillsuit among the Fremen was something a child learned before it learned to read. An improperly fitted stillsuit did not simply leak, it killed. They lived in underground cave communities called sieches, sealed against the desert heat and the desiccating night air, organized around a naib who led by demonstrated capability rather than hereditary claim. Within the sietch, an economy of strict mutual obligation kept the community alive. Water was shared with precise fairness. The collection of atmospheric moisture from the wind traps that dotted the rocky outcroppings above the sietches was a matter of collective effort and collective benefit. And inside all of it, threading every meal and every ceremony and every prayer, was the spice which the Fremen consumed daily, which had stained their eyes the deep solid blue of total saturation, the eyes of Ibad, and which had given their most spiritually sensitive members, the Sayadina, the ability to access other memory with a depth that the Bene Gesserit sisterhood had not anticipated when they planted their prophetic myths among the Fremen centuries before. The Fremen were also working. Across generations, in secret, Pardot Kynes and then his son, Liet Kynes, had given them a vision that most political theorists of the Imperium would have called impossible, and which the Fremen had embraced with the particular ferocity of a people for whom the word impossible had never been permitted to mean anything except not yet. They were terraforming Arrakis. Slowly, invisibly, they were planting wind traps and kanats and seed orchards in the sheltered places, accumulating water reserves in deep underground cisterns, building over generations the conditions that would, in 300 or 400 years of sustained effort, transform the deep desert into something livable. They called it the dream. They worked toward it with a patience that no single generation could have sustained alone, which was why it had to be encoded in their religion. The faith was the project management system. The belief was the organizational tool that kept a project running across timescales too long for any individual to hold. Without the faith, the work would have stopped when the people who began it died. With the faith, the work continued because it was sacred, and sacred things, by definition, survive the people who begin them. There was one problem with the dream that neither Pardot Kynes nor the Fremen had fully confronted. The sandworms could not survive in water. The ecological transformation of Arrakis would, if it succeeded, eventually destroy the very organisms that produced the spice. And without the spice, the Spacing Guild would collapse, and the Imperium would collapse with it. The desert and its worms were not merely a source of wealth, they were the pillar on which civilization stood. To make Arrakis green was to kick the pillar out. The Fremen had begun their dream without fully understanding that they were dreaming of the end of everything. It would take another generation of Atreides to understand this, and another still to fix it, at a cost that makes the word cost feel insufficient. House Atreides had held its homeworld of Caladan for 26 generations. Caladan was everything Arrakis was not. An ocean world of green islands and eternal mist, where rain fell without being prayed for, and water collected in pools without being stored, where the salt air came off the sea in waves that tasted of life rather than of sand and scarcity. The Atreides had ruled it with a consistency of character that was unusual in the feudal politics of the Imperium, where what a duke said he believed and what he actually practiced were routinely different things. Duke Leto Atreides was the head of this house when the story begins. He was a man in middle age, trim and dark-haired, with the kind of face that held authority without effort and the kind of bearing that made people around him behave as though better versions of themselves were possible. His household spoke of him in terms that the households of other dukes did not use about their own rulers. They spoke of him as someone who meant what he said. This was unusual enough to be remarkable. In an empire that ran on formal compliance masking actual intention, a man who meant what he said was, to some, a walking transparency that made everyone near him uncomfortable, and to others the most valuable quality in politics, because it generated real loyalty rather than the performed kind. And real loyalty in a crisis was worth 10 times any number of soldiers who were simply following orders. Leto was not married. He had a concubine, Lady Jessica, whom the Bene Gesserit had placed in his household at the appropriate political moment with very specific genetic instructions. Jessica was trained as a Bene Gesserit, with all that implied. She could read people with an accuracy that made ordinary social interaction, for her, into something resembling a chess game played against opponents who did not know they were playing. She could use the voice if she needed to, though she rarely did with Leto, who was sharp enough to sometimes notice. She loved him. And she had, in defiance of the sisterhood's explicit instructions, borne him a son instead of the daughter the breeding program required. The sisters had wanted a daughter who would have been bred in the next generation with Fade Rautha Harkonnen, producing the genetic combination they had calculated would give them their Kwisatz Haderach. Jessica had heard what Leto wanted and chosen love over obedience. She bore him a son. She named him Paul. Paul Atreides was 15 years old at the start of the story, and he was already wrong in ways that even his mother could not fully account for. The Bene Gesserit tests for their expected Kwisatz Haderach had pointed to his mother's generation, to the daughter Jessica had not produced. But Paul had been exposed to his mother's training since infancy. He had absorbed Prana Bindu instinctively. He had a Mentat's pattern recognition and a noble heir's political education, and something else that neither quality explained. A sensitivity to the movements of the future that arrived in his dreams as images too specific to be metaphor and too strange to be anything he had a name for yet. When the Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Moshiam tested him with the Gom Jabbar, the needle held ready to kill him if he pulled his hand from the box of neural pain, he passed. She was more disturbed by this than she allowed him to see. The household that surrounded Paul and Leto was a small ecosystem of extraordinary people. Tufi Hawat, the Mentat master of assassins, whose reddish eyes and absolute devotion to the Atreides had been the Duke's greatest intelligence asset for decades. Gurney Halleck, the War Master and Troubadour, a scarred man of great musical sensitivity and greater physical capability, who loved House Atreides with the unsentimental completeness of someone who had nothing before the Atreides gave him something. Duncan Idaho, the Swordmaster, the Duke's adoptive son in everything except legal designation, a warrior of such extraordinary ability that he could kill multiple Sardaukar simultaneously, which was theoretically impossible according to everyone's tactical calculations. Dr. Wellington Yueh, the personal physician certified by the Imperial Souk School, whose conditioning was supposed to make betrayal of his patients literally neurologically impossible. The Emperor's order arrived, and it was a death sentence, wearing the clothes of a promotion. House Atreides would be given the fief of Arrakis. They would take control of the planet. They would inherit the spice revenues that House Harkonnen had been extracting for 80 years. Duke Leto, who had spent the better part of his adult life building a military capability that the Emperor found inconveniently impressive, would move his household to the single most valuable and most dangerous piece of real estate in the universe. Leto saw it for what it was. His mentat saw it, his advisors saw it, and the Duke did the thing that defines his character more completely than any other single decision in the saga. He accepted, not because he was deceived, not because he underestimated the danger. He accepted because the alternatives were all forms of surrender, and he had not built what he built, or been the man he was, by surrendering to the calculations of men he did not respect. There was also, beneath the strategic acceptance, something harder to categorize. The spice revenues of Arrakis would make House Atreides genuinely powerful enough to challenge the Carino throne if it came to that. The Fremen, whose numbers and military capability were only beginning to be understood by Atreides' intelligence, were a potential force that no house had ever successfully cultivated. Arrakis was a trap. Yes, it was also the largest opportunity in a generation, and Leto Atreides was constitutionally incapable of walking away from either. House Harkonnen had held Arrakis for 80 years, and they had done so the way a wolf holds a sheep. Not with care, not with management, with consumption. Baron Vladimir Harkonnen was, by any neutral assessment, brilliant. He had to be brilliant to have maintained his house's position across decades of political manoeuvring in the Landsraad, to have accumulated the wealth and the alliances and the specific leverage over the Emperor that allowed him to be the instrument of what was about to happen rather than a victim of it. He was also a man in whom intelligence and cruelty had grown so intertwined that separating them had long since become impossible. He was enormously obese, his body so vast that it could no longer support its own weight without the assistance of suspensor belts that distributed it, so he moved through his black stone corridors, floating above the floor like a grotesque moon. He took pleasures that did not require the permission of their objects. He treated his servants and soldiers and subjects with the casual indifference of someone who had decided, early and without revisiting the decision, that other people's well-being was simply not a relevant data point. The Harkonnen hatred of the Atreides was old enough that its origin had faded into the contested mythology of two opposing families. Both houses told a story of betrayal at the Battle of Corin 10,000 years past. Both houses told it with their own ancestors in the role of the wronged party. What was not mythological, what was real and present and operational, was the specific quality of the Baron's hatred for Leto. It was the hatred that a certain kind of intelligent, ruthless man reserves for a peer whose reputation rests on qualities the ruthless man has explicitly rejected. Leto's honour was, to the Baron, a personal. The simple existence of House Atreides as a political entity that operated according to principles rather than expedients was an implicit condemnation of the Baron's methods. He wanted them erased. Not defeated, not absorbed. Erased, the trap he and the Emperor had constructed was elegant in the way that the cruelest mechanisms always are. Through the Harkonnens would withdraw from Arrakis, appearing to comply with the imperial order. The Atreides would arrive with their full household and military apparatus, concentrating everything on a world they did not understand and had not had time to prepare. The Harkonnen network of local agents, informants, and saboteurs would remain in place, invisible to Atreides, and then, once the Atreides were fully committed, with their supply lines back to Caladan effectively cut by distance and political circumstances, The Baron would return with a Harkonnen military force, secretly supplemented by 2 legions of Sardaukar fighting in Harkonnen colours. The Emperor required the disguise because the Great Convention prohibited him from moving openly against a Landsraad house without cause. If he was seen to destroy the Atreides with his own troops, every other house in the Landsraad would unite against him, because every other house would correctly read the action as a statement that no noble was safe from the Emperor's private ambitions. In Harkonnen colours, the Sardaukar could kill as many Atreides soldiers as they liked. The story would be a house war, a private feud. Finally, the Emperor's hands would appear clean. The mathematics required only that no Atreides survive to testify to what they had seen. The traitor inside the Atreides household was the element that made everything else possible. Dr. Wellington Yueh had been broken in the only way that Suk conditioning could be broken. The Harkonnens had his wife, a Bene Gesserit named Wanna, and they had been keeping her in conditions they described to Yueh with careful, measured specificity, enough detail to confirm her suffering without extinguishing the hope that kept him cooperative. A man without hope rebels. A man with just enough hope will do almost anything to protect it. Yueh did almost anything. He would disable the Duke's personal shield at the critical moment. He would drug Leto. He would place in the Duke's mouth a false tooth that could, when the Duke triggered it, release a poison gas powerful enough to kill everyone in a room. Yueh told himself across the months of his cooperation that the tooth was justice, that if he was going to betray the Duke, he would at least give the Duke the means to kill the Baron. He did not expect the Baron to be careless enough to be in range. He hoped, which is different from it, the Atreides came down through the Arrakeen atmosphere on a dry afternoon. The heat hit them as the ramps descended. The smell hit them simultaneously. Cinnamon and something beneath cinnamon, older and stranger and impossible to name, the smell of a planet that had been producing this particular chemical for millions of years and had infused it into every grain of its sand, every cubic meter of its air. Paul stood at the top of the ramp and looked out at the city of Arrakeen, at the shield wall rising behind it, at the desert beginning beyond the shield wall, and felt something he had no ready category for. Recognition, as if he had stood in this exact moment before, not in memory, but in something that lived below memory. In the dreaming place where his prescient sensitivity had been sending him images for years. He had dreamed this smell. He had dreamed this sky. He had dreamed the blue eyes of people he had not yet met, looking at him with something that was not quite recognition and not quite reverence, and that lived in the space between them. The first weeks on Arrakis were what military planners would call a foothold period. The Atreides established administrative control, took possession of the spice harvesting infrastructure, negotiated the cooperation of the CHOAM agents on planet, and began the process of building relationships with the people whose goodwill would determine whether the whole venture succeeded or failed. Duncan Idaho had gone ahead, making first contact with the Fremen of the deep desert, learning enough about them to know that they were far more numerous, far more capable, and far less impressed by imperial authority than any off-world estimate had suggested. He brought back a picture of a people who had been invisible to the Imperium, who could not be found in the deep desert because the deep desert was their home, who had been playing a longer game than anyone in the Imperium had understood. Leto understood almost immediately what this meant strategically. An alliance with the Fremen would change the entire equation. He sent word. He began negotiating. He showed Stilgar, the Neeb of Sietch, the kind of respect that Harkonnen governance had never extended to any Fremen, and Stilgar received that respect with the wariness of someone who had been given gifts before and found knives inside them. But the conversation was beginning. The Harkonnen attack came on a night already heavy with the smell of spice. Ewer delivered what he had promised. The shields went down, the communications jammed. The Sardaukar moved through the city with a silence and a speed that the Atreides' defensive perimeter, calibrated against the capabilities of conventional military forces, could not process in time. Duncan Idaho held the door longer than physics should have allowed. He killed 4 Sardaukar, then more, then was overwhelmed. Gurney Halleck broke out with a remnant and vanished into the underground. Thufir Hawat was captured alive, his mentat capabilities too valuable to waste, and brought to the Baron under the impression, which the Baron carefully maintained, that the traitor who had destroyed the Atreides had been Lady Jessica rather than the physician. Leto was paralyzed, dragged from his chambers, brought before the Baron. Ewer placed the tooth. He said what he needed to say to the Duke in the private register of apology and explanation, and then the Harkonnens killed him, and took his wife's body from its preservation, and showed it to him, and killed him again, and Wanna's long imprisonment ended. The Baron stood close to gloat. Duke Leto bit. The gas killed Peiter de Vries, the Harkonnen mentat. It killed others in the room. It did not kill the Baron, who activated his shield in time and floated above the carnage, damaged but alive, looking down at the Duke's body with the expression of a man who has just been inconvenienced. Paul and Jessica survived because Ewer had left an ornithopter on the roof, fueled, unguarded, with the ducal signet ring inside it. He could not undo what he had done. He could equip what he had started. The desert at night was not what the books had described. Paul had read everything available on it. He had studied the geological surveys, the ecological reports, the Fremen oral traditions transcribed and translated by imperial ethnographers who had never lived among the people they were translating. He had constructed a thorough mental model of the desert environment. The model was accurate. It was also completely insufficient preparation for the experience of actually being in the desert at night. Moving through sand in a stillsuit he was not yet fully comfortable wearing, listening to sounds that his mental model had not included. The wind through the rock formations created tones of extraordinary variation, almost musical, almost threatening. The sand settling as it cooled from the day's heat produced a whisper that seemed, under specific conditions of fear and exhaustion, to have the texture of intention. The stars, unsoftened by atmospheric moisture, were so numerous and so present that they seemed like a presence rather than a backdrop. Jessica moved beside him with the Bene Gesserit quality of absolute physical precision. She was afraid, and he knew it not because she showed it, but because he knew her well enough to read the specific adjustments she made in her bearing when she was managing fear rather than feeling its absence. She was also managing something else. She was pregnant. This was a fact she had not mentioned, because there was nothing to be done about it, and because information without actionable consequence was. In the crisis they were inside. Simply wait. They were found. Not by Harkonnens, by Fremen. Stilgar's patrol had been watching since the night the city burned. Fremen watched everything in their desert. The question was not whether they would find the off-worlders. The question was what the finding would mean. Paul and Jessica were carrying water. In Fremen law, the water of off-worlders who die in the desert belongs to whoever finds them. The economics of the situation pointed toward a straightforward resolution. What complicated the economics was Jessica. She recognized from everything the Missionaria Protectiva had seeded in Fremen religion the precise structure of the myths she was standing inside. She knew what the prophecies promised. She knew what signs the Fremen were trained to recognize. And she used that knowledge the way a Bene Gesserit trained to use everything available to her. She spoke the right words. She positioned herself within the mythic frame. She made the Fremen uncertain, and uncertainty is, in political terms, an opening. A Fremen named Jamis challenged Paul to the knife. In Fremen culture, the challenge was an offer. Kill me, or be killed. It was also, though Paul did not fully understand this yet, a test. Paul killed Jamis efficiently and without excessive violence, with a style of movement that the watching Fremen recognized as trained in ways the off-world style should not have been able to replicate. He then did something that no off-worlder had ever done in their experience. He wept for the man he had killed. He asked for the Fremen name of the man's water. He performed, instinctively and without instruction, the precise emotional acknowledgement that Fremen culture required of someone who had taken a life. Stilgar named him Usul, strength at the base of the pillar. The Fremen gave him a second name, the public name, Muad'Dib. The desert mouse, the small creature that survives because it is perfectly adapted to the harshest possible environment, because it has learned to find within the desert not merely conditions to endure, but conditions to thrive inside. Paul accepted the name without yet fully understanding that in accepting it, he was beginning to put on the myth the Bene Gesserit had built 200 years before his birth. They were taken to Sietch Tabba, and the education that would, over the next 2 years, produce something the universe had not previously contained, began. The desert education was not an abstraction. It was physical before it was anything else. Paul learned the sandwalk first, the precisely irregular gait that distributed vibration across the sand without creating the rhythmic pulse that attracted a worm. Getting it wrong meant being found. Being found by a worm meant being consumed without ceremony by the largest organism on the planet. The motivation to learn correctly was absolute. He learned the stillsuit disciplines, how to check the seals each morning, how to monitor the recycling efficiency across a long march, how to read the warning signs of equipment failure before the failure became fatal. He learned to navigate by the stars of Arrakis specifically, not by stars in general, because the constellations of Arrakis were not the constellations of Caladan, and a navigator working from the wrong map was dead in a different direction than he had intended. Chani taught him much of this. Chani was the daughter of Liet Kynes, which made her, in the double existence that the planetologist's family lived. Both the daughter of an imperial civil servant and a daughter of the Fremen deep desert. She had her father's analytical precision and her mother's desert capability, and she combined them with the practical directness of someone who had never been permitted to learn anything she could not immediately apply. She saw Paul with something that the myths could not account for. She did not see him as a messiah. She saw him as a person who was trying very hard and succeeding faster than people usually succeeded, and who was still unmistakably learning. The gap between those two perceptions, what the mythology said he was and what she actually observed, would define their relationship for the rest of her life. He trained the Fremen fighters in what the Bene Gesserit called the weirding way. The combat system his mother had been teaching him since he could walk. The Fremen were already extraordinary fighters. Adding the weirding way to what they already possessed created something that was, in military terms, genuinely alarming to think about. Paul thought about it constantly because he was also beginning, as the months of spice exposure accumulated, to see. The prescience was not clean. It did not arrive as a clear forecast. It arrived as images, as flashes of possible futures, as emotional certainties about directions he could not always name. He dreamed with specific and verifiable detail events that had not happened yet. He saw futures branching from the present moment, like rivers delta-ing across a flat plain, and in the vast majority of those he saw fire. He saw armies in his name across the stars. He saw counting impossible numbers, the tallied dead of a holy war that had not started, and that he could already feel the shape of forming around him like a current he had waded into without meaning to. He told himself it could be avoided. He told himself, across those 2 years, that the futures he was seeing were warnings rather than forecasts. He was wrong, but he did not know it yet, and knowing it would not have changed the choices available to him. The choice he had was not between a holy war and no holy war. The choice was between a holy war fought for a goal and a holy war fought with no goal at all. This distinction, which seems academic until you are counting the dead on the other side of it, mattered more than he understood. Jessica underwent the transformation that the Fremen required of a woman who was to become their reverend mother. She drank the water of life, the poisonous secretion of a drowned worm larva, a substance the Bene Gesserit used in their own spice agony under conditions of much greater preparation. She transformed it. She survived. She emerged from the ordeal, carrying other memory in its full accessible, and the voices that now lived in her included every Fremen Reverend Mother who had come before her, a line extending back through the generations of Fremen consciousness since the Missionaria Protectiva first embedded the myth that called Jessica's descendants to Arrakis. The transformation also, in circumstances that the Bene Gesserit had specifically warned against, reached the daughter Jessica was carrying. Elia Atreides was born pre-born. She arrived in the world with other memory already active, a consciousness that had never been simply a child, that had been carrying the weight of ancestral voices since before its birth. The sisterhood had a word for what she was, and they did not use the word kindly. Abomination. Paul drank the water of life alone, without the guidance of a fully established Reverend Mother beside him, in a moment of personal crisis when the vision had become too crowded with fire to navigate any other way. He fell into a coma. He lay in it for 3 weeks. When he woke, he was different. The prescience, which had been arriving as images and flashes and emotional certainties, had organized itself into something comprehensive. He could now, with genuine deliberateness, walk among the branching futures and select a path. He could see not just what was likely, but what was possible. He could hold in his mind simultaneously the current moment and its most probable evolution across weeks and months. He had become the Kwisatz Haderach. A generation early, outside the Sisterhood's control, on a desert world that had not been in any of the official plans. He saw the golden path for the first time in that waking, the specific, horrible, necessary road that a human being would have to walk to prevent the extinction of the species across the coming millennia. He saw it clearly. He refused it. He told himself that morning that he was not the kind of man capable of paying that price. He was a 15-year-old boy from a rainy ocean world who had been in the desert for less than 2 years. He would be forgiven for not having guessed what payment the universe was about to demand. The war came in the year 10,193 after Guild. 2.5 years after the night the Atreides fell. Emperor Shaddam IV had come to Arrakis in person, with the Sardaukar, with the Baron, with the full ceremonial apparatus of the Imperial court. The spice operations had been hemorrhaging under the pressure of Fremen raids that the Harkonnen administration had consistently misreported as minor and manageable. They were not minor. They had been systematic, coordinated, and increasingly sophisticated because they had been led by a Mentat-trained duke's son who could see how they would end before they began. The Emperor arrived to stabilize the situation. He brought the finest military force in the known universe. He had no adequate conceptual framework for what he was about to face. Paul used the family atomics. The weapons the Great Convention forbade against human targets did not forbid against terrain. The shield wall, the enormous geological formation that separated Arrakis from the open desert, was not a human target. Paul detonated the atomics at its base, blew a gap in it wide enough for a Coriolis storm to pass through. The Fremen followed the storm, mounted on sandworms, thousands of them, tens of thousands, a force whose number the Imperial tacticians would spend years trying to account for, because their estimates of the Fremen population had been wrong by a factor of 10. The worms rode through a space where the Sardaukar shields had been shorted out in the open desert against enemies they could not shield against because shields attracted worms. The Sardaukar were fighting in conditions they had not been designed for. They were extraordinary fighters. The Fremen were more extraordinary in their own desert. The Sardaukar broke, not from cowardice, from the mathematics of a situation that no amount of training could have prepared them for. Their training had been designed to produce the best soldiers in the Imperium. It had not been designed to produce men who could defeat an army of desert-hardened warriors fighting on home terrain in conditions that neutralized every Sardaukar technical advantage simultaneously. Baron Vladimir Harkonnen was killed during the chaos of the instrument of his death was a small girl with a Gom Jabbar needle, a 4-year-old child who walked into the Imperial command tent and named her grandfather and placed the needle in his neck and watched him die. Elia Atreides, born pre-born, had never been a child in any conventional sense. She was fully conscious, fully capable, carrying the memories of lifetimes she had not lived. She achieved it with the clinical precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and was not troubled by it. Paul stood in the ruined Imperial court and faced Shaddam IV across the wreckage of the most powerful military force the Imperium had ever assembled. He offered terms. Marriage to Princess Irulan, the Emperor's eldest daughter, whose Bene Gesserit training made her politically sophisticated enough to understand the offer precisely as it was made. The Emperor would abdicate effective power. The Corino throne would continue, but as a formal institution. House Atreides would hold real authority. The spice would continue to flow. Any house that refused to ratify this arrangement would find that Paul Atreides, who held in his prescient memory the complete chemistry of the water of life and the spice cycle, could end melange production permanently. The Guild navigators in orbit received this threat. They tested it against their own oracular vision. The threat was real. The Guild told the Emperor so, and the Emperor capitulated, because an Emperor who could not move his armies across the stars was not an Emperor at all. Paul Muad'Dib Atreides, 21 years old, became the Paddy Sharp Emperor of the known universe. He gave the throne to Chani unofficially, in the only way that mattered. He gave Irulan the title and the formal position. He told her that their marriage would produce no children. She understood. She was a politician in the truest sense, and she would spend decades performing her role with grace she did not always feel. It looked, for a moment, like the kind of ending that wraps things up cleanly. It was not. It was the beginning of the worst part. Dune Messiah opens with a number. 61 billion dead. That is the cost, 12 years after the coronation, of the holy war carried out in the name of Muad'Dib. The Fremen, armed with the finest military technology the Atreides treasury could supply, fired by the absolute certainty of their religious conviction, had swept across the human universe in what they called a jihad, and what the surviving populations of 90 sterilized planets called something for which the human vocabulary of horror is barely adequate. They did not go out to conquer. They went out to convert. But conversion, when refused, became conquest. And conquest, when resisted, became extermination. The mathematics were simple, and the mathematics were devastating. Paul had tried to slow it. He had issued orders, signed restrictions, attempted to redirect the energy of the crusade into less catastrophic channels. The Gesserit, the priestly bureaucracy that had formed around his cult, filtered everything. They did not lie, exactly. They simply ensured that communications from the Emperor reached the fighting forces in interpretations consistent with the faith rather than with the man's actual intent. The faith had escaped him. The religion had become something he did not recognize and could not control, and it was burning the universe in his name. And every morning he sat behind the eyes of his prescience and looked for the path that led somewhere other than deeper into fire, and every morning the paths led there anyway. This is the central argument of Dune Messiah, the argument that Herbert had always intended the saga to make. The first novel built a hero so compelling, so complete, so satisfying to follow, that the reader did not notice they were being set up. The second novel pointed at the reader directly. The hero you were prepared to worship has produced a holy war that killed 61 billion people. The religion you were invited to find thrilling has become a planetary-scale atrocity. The tragedy is not that Paul failed. The tragedy is that the Messiah problem does not come from choosing the wrong Messiah. It comes from the institution of Messianism itself, from the human appetite for certainty and leadership that takes any figure of sufficient charisma and builds around them a faith immune to correction. The conspiracy against him assembled from the people with the most to lose from the continuation of his absolute power. The Bene Gesserit, who had spent 90 generations building toward the Kwisatz Haderach as a controlled asset and had received instead a messiah they could not manage. The Spacing Guild, specifically a navigator named Edric, who had his own mild prescient capability, and who had discovered that two prescient beings cannot see each other clearly, which meant that Edric's presence in the conspiracy shielded it from Paul's sight. The Bene Gesserit, the genetic masters whose axolotl tanks could regrow human beings from cellular material and who manufactured the shape-shifting face dancers capable of impersonating any human target. And, with great reluctance and specific grief, Princess Irulan, who had been ordered by the Sisterhood to slip a contraceptive into Cheney's food so that Paul would have no legitimate Atreides heir, who had been following those orders for 12 years, who was beginning to feel the weight of what she had agreed to carry. The gift they brought was beautiful in the way that the most dangerous things often are. The Tleilaxo had grown a Gola of Duncan, Idaho, a body regrown from preserved cells of the Swordmaster who had died holding the door for Paul's escape 12 years earlier. The Gola had been given a new name, Hate, and a modified personality that appeared to have no memory of being Duncan. He was presented as a gift of homage from the Tleilaxu masters, a genuinely extraordinary act of biological artistry. Paul accepted him. Paul assigned him as a companion to Elia, and buried inside Hate, programmed into the deep architecture of his trained reflexes by Tleilaxu workmanship, was a command. If anything ever triggered his original memories, if the Gola ever recovered the full experience of being Duncan, Idaho, the recovery would also activate the kill order. Hate would become the weapon that killed his emperor. Chani, meanwhile, had discovered the contraceptive. She stopped taking whatever Irulan had been providing in the way of dietary supplements and switched to a traditional Fremen fertility regimen. She conceived. The birth she was now carrying would be the crisis point around which everything else organized. Othame, one of the old Fedekin from the early years, came to the palace with names. Fedekin were Paul's death commandos, the fighters from the deep desert who had carried the earliest attacks against the Harkonnens. Othame had survived 12 years of imperial expansion and had come, at great personal danger, to deliver the names of the conspirators to his emperor. He could not deliver them directly because his own house was watched. He gave Paul a small Tleilaxu dwarf named Bijaz who knew the names. And then Othame died. And Paul carried Bijaz home. And in the street outside Othame's house, Bijaz spoke, and what Bijaz spoke was the preparation that Tleilaxu had in the phrase that would trigger Hate's programming. Paul saw the next few seconds with perfect prescient clarity and did the most human thing he had done in 12 years of semi-divine governance. He walked toward them anyway, because the only alternatives were worse. The stone burner detonated. It was a Tleilaxu weapon designed specifically against prescient rulers, a device whose radiation destroyed the physical eyes while leaving the body otherwise intact. The Sardaukar surrounding Paul were temporarily blinded. Paul's eyes were destroyed. By Fremen tradition, a blind man walked into the desert because the blind were a burden the tribe could not carry. Paul's religion would not permit the empire to simply observe its own emperor's tradition and allow him to die quietly in the sand. Paul refused to walk into the desert immediately. The prescient sight that his burned-out eyes had physically housed was not housed there. It ran through him in ways that the eyes had been a window for, not a source of. He could still see, not with his face, with his memory of the future. He moved through the palace corridors by remembering precisely what he had already seen of each moment before it arrived. He named new servants before they were introduced. He poured water into cups set at angles he could not have detected. He walked the present moment like a man who had already been here and was simply repeating familiar steps. He watched Chani die in childbirth. He had not foreseen the twins. He had seen Chani's death. He had seen one child. The twins, Leto and Ganima, surprised him in a way that nothing had surprised him in years, and the surprise was the specific anguish of discovering that your prescient sight, your absolute burden, has been incomplete. There were more of them than he had expected to love and then lose. Hate, in the crisis moment after Chenny's death, received the triggering phrase from Cytail, the face dancer assassin who had come for Paul's children with a knife. The programming activated. The kill order fired. Duncan Idaho stood in a palace corridor in a body that had not been his original body, holding a blade, and felt something happening inside himself that the Tleilaxu had not anticipated. The command pressed toward execution. The human being underneath it pressed back. In the history of Tleilaxu Gola production, no Gola had ever recovered its original memories without the recovery being fatal. Hate recovered his, and the recovery was not fatal to Paul, because the recovery was stronger than the command, because Duncan Idaho had chosen, in the final internal crisis of that moment, to be who he had been rather than what he had been made into. He was the first. He would not be the last. Cytail was killed by a dagger Paul threw, using his son's newborn prescient vision, seeing through Leto's infant eyes the angle and the distance. The conspiracy collapsed. The conspirators, where they could be found, were dealt with according to justice. Irulan, who had betrayed her orders when it mattered most, who had thrown off the sisterhood's instructions the moment the instructions meant killing children, was forgiven and given the children to raise. Paul Atreides, having survived everything, having killed the Baron and faced the Emperor and won the throne and watched the holy war spread and watched Chani die, put on the blind man's robes. He walked into the desert. The Fremen watched him go. They wept and prayed. The tradition of the blind seer walking out into the open sand was known to them. It was holy. They believed it was holy. Paul walked into it. He did not die. The preacher was a blind man who appeared in the cities of Arrakis more than a decade later, accompanied by a young boy guide, preaching against the religion that had spread in Paul Muad'Dib's name. He said Muad'Dib was a false messiah. He said the He said the terraforming of Arrakis was a death sentence for the planet and everyone on it, because every wind trap planted, every kanat dug, every hectare of desert converted to greenery was a step toward the conditions that would end the sandworms and end the spice and end the civilization built on it. He was treated as a madman. He was not wrong. Children of Dune opens 9 years after Paul's walk into the desert. 2 children are at the center of everything. Leto and Genema Atreides, 9 years old, are living in Sietch Tabr under the guardianship of Stilgar, while their aunt Elia rules the Imperium as regent. They have inherited, through the circumstances of their birth and the saturation of their mother's body with spice, the pre-born condition that Elia shares. Other memory is active inside them. The voices of their ancestors speak within their awareness with a specificity and presence that no adult training could have prepared them for. They manage this by talking to each other. The twin bond, the connection between 2 consciousnesses that shared a womb, gives them a resource that Elia never had. They can compare experiences. They can name what is happening to each other. They can say, when a particular ancestor is pressing too hard at the boundaries of a particular identity, I see what is happening to you, and I am still here, and we are not them. The naming saves them. For a while, what they can also see, because the prescient capacity runs in the Atreides bloodline and the spice has unlocked it in them from infancy, is what is happening to Arrakis, and what will happen if nothing changes. The ecological transformation is accelerating under Elia's regency, partly because the Gesserit has declared it a religious imperative, and partly because no one in Paul's court wants to be the person who argues that the greening of Dune is a mistake. Leto and Ganima can do the math. The sand trout cannot survive free surf. The worm population is already declining in the northern regions where the vegetation has taken hold. If the transformation continues at its current rate, within 2 generations the worms will be gone. The spice production will collapse, and everything built on spice will fall. The external threats to the twins are real and specific. House Corrino, the deposed, makes an attempt on their lives using genetically modified creatures called Larza tigers, powerful predators smuggled onto Arrakis. The twins survive. The event hardens something in Leto that was already beginning to harden, an understanding that the political situation requires action rather than analysis, that the future he can see unfolding does not improve. Elia's decline is happening simultaneously and more visibly to those close enough to look at her clearly. She had been ruling for 9 years when Children of Dune begins. Ruling had done to her what ruling does to people who were already under enormous internal pressure. She drank more spice, she spent more time in the inner reaching into other memory for counsel and support that her actual life was not providing. And inside other memory, in the crowded chorus of her ancestral inheritance, one particular voice had been waiting. One particular dead ancestor had been patient. Baron Vladimir Harkonnen had lived inside Elia's genetics since the moment her father's lineage met her mother's. He had been there from the beginning. He had been observing. He had learned everything about how her mind worked, what she needed, what frightened her, what she reached for when she was desperate. He had learned to offer those things in the internal space where thought lived, so that his counsel arrived wearing the texture of her own ideas. She let him in, not in a single dramatic moment of surrender, in the way that the desert receives things, gradually, completely, without announcement. She let him in across months of small agreements, small acceptances, small moments when the voice that sounded like her own thoughts was offering something she needed too badly to refuse. By the time the court noticed that something was wrong, the Baron was not merely whispering through Elia, he was co-piloting, and a woman who had been fierce and strange and capable was becoming something that the Fremen who had loved her could not name without grief. Leto made the choice that defines his existence in a place called Shuloch, in the deep southern desert, after a long and painful journey through captivity and escape and the kind of internal reckoning that only happens when the choices available have reduced themselves to a single terrible one. He had been looking for his father. He had found the preacher. They had spoken in the desert, father and son, blind man and boy who could see multiple futures simultaneously, and Paul had told him he had seen the golden path. He had refused it. He hoped Leto would also refuse it. He spoke this hope with the knowledge that it was probably futile, because he had raised a son capable of seeing further than he could, and a son who could see further than his father would understand what the father had refused to look at directly. The sand trout gathered at Leto's feet, the small flat pre-worm creatures, drawn by the moisture his body expressed in the desert air, began to move toward him with the purposeful non-intelligence of organisms following biochemical gradients toward what they needed. Leto allowed it. He saturated his skin with spice essence, making his cells chemically compatible with the sand trout biology in a way that normal human skin was not. He held still as they climbed his feet and shins and covered his arms. He held still in the way that required every prana bindu technique his Bene Gesserit training had given him access to, plus whatever the prescient awareness added in terms of knowing exactly which muscles to hold and which to release, and for how long. The sand trout fused with his skin. He became something the universe had not previously seen. Not quite human, not yet a worm. A breed. He returned to Arrakis. He returned as something that could not be killed by any weapon in the arsenal of anyone who might want to kill him. He stood in the throne room and addressed his aunt and the court and the religion that had grown up around his father's name. He offered Elia the possibility of fighting back against what was eating her. She could not. She threw herself from the Baron died with her body. Leto II Atreides took the throne. He was 9 years old in the body. He was already, in the consciousness, something much older. He told Ganima what the Golden Path required. Ganima understood. She would live a human life. She would carry the Atreides line forward through her children. She would grieve her brother, because what the Golden Path required of Leto was the end of everything that made Leto human, and she was allowed to grieve that, and she did. He told her it was necessary. She did not argue. She had seen what he had seen. She knew the mathematics. She grieved anyway, because mathematics and grief are not mutually exclusive, and a person who does not grieve the cost of what is necessary has already paid too high a price for something else. 3,500 years passed. Frank Herbert asked his reader to hold that number and mean it. 3,500 years. Not a metaphor. Not narrative shorthand for a long time. 3,500 years of a single continuous consciousness ruling the human universe, accumulating experience, watching every person it had ever known die and be replaced by strangers who were then also known and also died, watching civilizations rise and calcify and collapse and reform, watching the species it had sacrificed its humanity to save make the same mistakes in new costumes across the centuries, and then make new mistakes because the old ones had become too familiar. God Emperor of Dune opens in this impossible place. Leto II, the God Emperor, Lord of the Imperium, Majestrix of the Spice, has been living inside the sentence he passed on himself in the desert for 3,500 years. His body, when the novel opens, is 7 meters long and more than 2 meters in diameter, a ribbed, segmented creature of pinkish-grey sandtrout flesh moved on a customized cart that protects him from the water that is still, despite everything, fatal to the worm biology that now constitutes most of what he is. At one end of him, raised on the neck column of the creature he has become, is a human face. Still recognizably Atreides, still carrying in it something of the 9-year-old boy who made the choice that produced this. He does not sleep in the way that humans sleep. He does not eat in the way that humans eat. He has not been able to be touched in 3,500 years because the sandtrout membrane that covers him completely does not transmit sensation in the way that human skin does. And the sensation it transmits is not the same thing as what it replaced. The political architecture of the empire he has built is total in a way that previous empires could not have been, because previous empires were run by mortals who had finite attention spans and finite lifetimes. Leto's attention span is functionally infinite. He has seen every argument for making an exception to his rules across 35 centuries of people making them, and he has held his rules anyway. Because the rules are not about managing the current generation, they are about managing all future generations, about tilting the long-term probabilities in directions that no short-term consideration justifies compromising. He controls all spice production. There are no more sandworms on Arrakis. He has hoarded. He releases it in measured quantities to those who serve him and withholds it from those who do not, and the Guild and the Bene Gesserit and every institution that requires melange to function are therefore dependent on his goodwill in the most absolute possible way. He has dismantled the Landsraad. He has diminished Chom to an administrative function. He has replaced the Emperor's Sardaukar with an all-female army he calls the Fish Speakers, designed around his analysis of what makes male armies dangerous to the populations they nominally protect. He runs a breeding program that makes the Bene Gesserit's 90-generation effort look modest by comparison, because he has had 35 centuries to refine it, and the clarity of prescient vision to know exactly what he is selecting for. He is selecting for invisibility to prescient sight. He has been, all along, preparing the species for a future in which no prescient ruler can find every human being. A future in which the species is distributed widely enough and diversely enough that no single catastrophe, no single predatory oracle, no single monstrous mistake of the kind his father made can touch all of it at once. He is not trying to govern humanity. He is trying to make humanity safe from any future government, including his own. The Duncan Idaho Golas continue. The Tleilaxo have been growing them for centuries, each new body grown from preserved cells, each new Gola sent to the God Emperor's court as a combination of tribute and experiment, because the Tleilaxo are waiting for something about the Gola program that they have not yet fully articulated even to themselves. Each Duncan serves for a few decades. Each Duncan, eventually, with the specific, undefeatable directness of the original, tries to kill the thing that has become his emperor. Each one fails, Each one is replaced by the next. Leto loves each of them in the way that an immortal learns to love what does not last, which is to say completely and without expectation of permanence, and with a grief that has been practiced so many times that it has lost its edge. Hui Nuri arrives from Ix as the new Ixian ambassador. The Ixians had built her inside a no-chamber, a space shielded from all prescient observation, designing her at every level to be, to the God Emperor, irresistible. She was sweet in the precise way that 35 centuries of isolation had taught Leto to hunger for. Not politically sweet, genuinely, humanly sweet, calm and intelligent, and entirely without the ambition or manipulation that every other person who approached him was carrying. Because Hui had not been built with those things. She had been built with their absence. Leto, who could see everything except what the no-chamber had concealed, saw immediately what she was and what the Ixians had done. He fell in love with her anyway. He had been alone for too long to do otherwise. The current Duncan Idaho, watching this, hated the God Emperor in the specific way of someone who has discovered a feeling too large to contain. He also loved Hui Nuri. He was constitutionally incapable of not loving someone who was genuinely good, and she was genuinely good, and the triangle this produced was the human core of a novel that otherwise operates at the scale of geological time. Siona Atreides, the daughter of Leto's majordomo Moneo, was a rebel. The underground that opposed the God Emperor's rule was not a genuine threat. Leto knew it existed. He had allowed it to exist as a kind of institutional pressure valve and occasionally as a testing ground. Siona had grown up in it, and she had grown up furious in the specific way of someone who can see the evidence of a tyranny and cannot convince herself that the tyranny's long-term justifications are adequate compensation for the daily reality of living inside it. She was also, though she did not know this, the culmination. She was the result of 35 centuries of selective breeding. She was the human being who could not be seen in prescient vision. When Leto looked at the future and looked for Siona, he saw nothing where she should have been. A hole in the universe, a presence registered by its absence, and the hole meant that the breeding program had worked. And the breeding program working meant that the golden path was nearly complete. He sent her into the Saria, the preserved desert, for a survival test. All Atreides' descendants underwent it because only those who survived could carry the genetics forward. She nearly died. She drank the spice essence and saw, briefly, what Leto saw in his prescient vision. She saw not the grandeur of the plan, but the specific, terrible thing the plan was for. She saw the extinction scenario, the one where the species, kept too centralized, too dependent, too easily findable, is destroyed by something that can see all of it at once. She understood, intellectually, why he had done what he had done. She came home from the desert, still wanting him dead, because understanding why a tyrant did what he did does not require you to accept. The bridge was where the Siona plot came together with the Duncan plot and with the quiet inevitability of a man who has known for centuries exactly how his own death would come. Leto had arranged his own assassination. Not obviously, not in any way that could be cleanly proven. But the arrangements that left Nayla, a fish speaker, loyal, in a position where Siona's orders would override her military training, had not been made by accident. The wedding procession to Hui Nuri crossed the bridge over the Idaho River, the river Leto himself had named for a swordmaster dead 3.5 millennia. Nayla fired at the bridge's supports. The bridge fell. The river and water destroyed the God Emperor's sand-trout membrane from the outside in, the sand-trout separating and fleeing the moisture, the worm biology burning, without the protection of the living membrane. the human consciousness at the center of the compound organism dispersing with the organism's death. Hui Nuri died in the fall. Monio died in the fall. Leto II, the god emperor, the worm emperor, the tyrant, died on the bank of the river he had named for the first friend he had ever lost. He had time, as the dispersal happened, to tell Siona what she was, and what she had just done, and what the sandtrout, carrying in their biology the genetic information of 35 centuries of symbiosis with a human consciousness, scattered into the wet sand of a planet that was beginning, finally, to give them what they needed. The new desert was starting to grow. In time, from those sandtrout, new worms would emerge, smaller, different, carrying in their ecological role the inheritance of what the cycle would restart. On a planet that would not be Arrakis forever, but would be what Arrakis needed to become. The scattering began within a generation, deprived of the absolute governing intelligence that had maintained its stability. The spice supply contracted. The institutions that had served the God Emperor's plan, but had never fully understood it, lost their organizing principle, and a civilization of trillions found itself in the specific crisis of a complex system that has had its central node removed. The famine times were not simply economic collapse. They were the convulsive reorganization of every dependency that the God Emperor's 35 centuries of micromanagement had created, all releasing simultaneously. Food shipments ceased. Medical supply networks broke. The Guild, rationing their navigators' spice access as the supply shrunk, cut routes. Worlds that had been connected were suddenly isolated, and people, being people, fled. The scattering was not organized. That was the point. It was not a program or a policy. It was billions of individual human beings making the individual calculation that the crisis in the known universe was worse than the unknown darkness beyond its mapped edges. They took ships. They took the Holtzman drives and the Guild charts that covered the known territory, and they went past the edge of those charts into space that no navigator had mapped, that no prescient eye had seen, that no institutional memory had recorded. They scattered across the unmapped dark in numbers that could not be counted, carrying every human language and every human religion and every human genome, carrying also, buried in the genetics of every human population that had ever lived under the Atreides rule, the selective modification that Leto had spent 35 centuries installing. The invisibility to prescient sight was in them. It would spread through reproduction. It would, across the generations, become a feature of the species itself rather than a feature of a specific lineage. Humanity dispersed. The known universe shrank into a smaller thing, a remnant, and in the dark beyond the remnant, human populations evolved for centuries in isolation, shaped by whatever pressures the unknown offered. Some of what those pressures produced came back. And when it came back, it brought something it did not fully understand, something it was running from, something that the known universe was not prepared to recognize. 1,500 years after the God Emperor's death. Heretics of Dune. The world that opens this novel is old in a way that requires specific understanding. It is not simply that time has passed. It is that the specific kind of time that passes after a great ordering force is removed has passed, leaving institutions that survived the transition still operating in patterns established by the force that is no longer there, like ruts in a road that the carts still follow even after the road has been repurposed. The Bene Gesserit still exists, still practices the same, still maintains the same institutional culture, still runs variations on a breeding program whose original goal was long ago revised upward. The Spacing Guild still navigates. The Bene Gesserit, the genetic masters of the Axlotiel tanks, still produces golas and face dancers and synthetic biological products whose exact manufacturing process they guard with a fanaticism that has always struck outsiders as disproportionate to its commercial purpose. The world of Arrakis is what Arrakis has become after 1,500 years of continuing ecological transformation. The desert that remains, the Rakian Desert, is still substantial enough to maintain a sandworm population. The worms that grew from the dispersed sand trout of Leto's death are smaller than their ancestors, adapted to the partially transformed ecology, but they produce spice. The religion of the divided god, the cult that grew around the memory of the god emperor, maintains that the worms are his transfigured body. That the spice is his blood, that worshipping correctly means the possibility of reunion with the consciousness that diffused itself into the desert that made him. This is, in the way of religions, not wrong about what it is wrong about. It is wrong about specifics. It is not wrong about the fundamental transaction. The Bene Gesserit are not ruling in the overt sense. They are, as always, threading. They have a specific concern about Arrakis. The concern is a girl named Shiana. Shiana is an orphan who appeared in the Rakian desert after her family was killed in a worm attack, who was found alive in the open desert when no child should have survived it, who was brought to the priests of the divided god as a miracle and presented herself as exactly that. Because the worms came to her. They did not eat her. They listened, in whatever sense that creatures of the sandworm's biology can listen, to what she communicated to them in the language of spice and stillsuit, and the particular quality of her presence among the sand. She commanded them. Not with technology, not with maker hooks, but with whatever she was, biologically, or psychologically, or in some combination that the Bene Gesserit recognized as relevant, without being able to immediately categorize it. They sent Dawi Odrade to Arrakis. Odrade was a reverend mother with an unusual quality for her institution, an ability to feel things that Bene Gesserit training typically suppressed, not sentimentality but genuine human warmth, a capacity for attachment that her superiors had tried to discipline out of her and had not quite managed. She was also, in the particular way that certain Atreides characteristics had threaded through the Bene Gesserit breeding program, a very distant descendant of the Atreides line. She would have recognized in a mirror something of Leto's face. This was not coincidence. Very little in Bene Gesserit genetics was. Miles Tegh was the Bashar, the supreme military commander of the Bene Gesserit's defensive forces, retired but not forgotten, living on Gamu, the planet formerly known as Giedi Prime, the Harkonnen homeworld, in the particular comfortable obscurity of someone who has been too good at his job and is now experiencing the specific quiet of competence in the absence of a task worthy of it. He had a face that historians of the old Atreides acknowledged as unsettling in its resemblance to the portraits of Duke Leto Atreides I, which was again not coincidence. He would be given a task worthy of him. He would be given the latest Duncan Idaho Gola. This Duncan was different. The Tleilaxu had been growing Duncans for 50. Each new Gola was nominally the same, grown from the same cellular template, awakened through the same triggering protocol. But the Tleilaxu had been doing something else alongside the nominal Gola production, something they had not disclosed to their clients. They had been refining the template. Each generation of Duncan incorporated something learned from the previous generation's development. The Duncan that Tegh received was not simply the same Duncan Idaho that had served the God Emperor and all the emperors before the God Emperor. He was the accumulated Duncan. He carried, in his genetics and in the specific architecture of his neural development, the trace of every iteration before him, not as accessible memory yet, but as depth, as pattern, as an intensity of capability that exceeded what the original template could have predicted. Tech protected him on Gamu, while Odrade managed the situation on Arrakis, while Taraza, the Mother Superior, played the larger game. The larger game was brutal in the way that Bene Gesserit games at the highest level always were. Taraza had determined that the continued existence of Arrakis as the primary spice world was a chain the Sisterhood needed to break. As long as the spice came only from Arrakis, every political calculation in the known universe centered on Arrakis, and everything centered on Arrakis was, ultimately, controlled by whoever could threaten its production. The God Emperor had controlled it. The honoured Matras were going to control it next, unless the Bene Gesserit acted. Taraza's plan required one sandworm transferred alive to Chapter House, the Sisterhood's home planet, where conditions were being prepared to support a new desert ecology. And then, with the worm and its nascent spice cycle secured elsewhere, the honoured Matries could be provoked into destroying Arrakis, and the Bene Gesserit would survive the destruction of the old source, because the new source would already be growing in their own desert. The honoured matres were what everyone in the old empire was calling the women coming back from the scattering. They were unmistakable. They moved faster than Bene Gesserit-trained fighters. They used a sexual conditioning technique, a weaponized version of pheromone chemistry and neurological imprinting that created in any man they applied it to a dependency so complete that withdrawal from their presence produced effects resembling severe addiction withdrawal. They claimed no relationship to the Bene Gesserit. They claimed no name for whatever they were, simply choosing to be called by the descriptive honorific that others gave them. And they had arrived in the old empire apparently running from something, which made them the most dangerous kind of enemy, because an enemy in flight has nothing left to protect and nothing left to lose. The Bene Gesserit recognized them. Not immediately and not completely. The honoured Matras were women who had left in the scattering. They were descended from Bene Gesserit sisters, from fish speakers, from the various female institutions that the God Emperor's rule had created and that the scattering had sent into the dark. They had met something in that dark. They had fought something or been hunted by something, and in the fighting or the running they had become this. The specific combat capability of the honoured Matress made sense when you understood that they had been shaped by an adversarial pressure of extraordinary intensity. What shaped them must have been, in their own experience, existential. They had survived it. They had come back. And they were doing to the old empire, systematically, what had been. Because organisms shaped by existential predation tend to externalize the predation once the original predator is no longer immediately present. Teg was captured on Gamu. He was interrogated with a Tleilaxu device called a T-probe, which disassembled consciousness while extracting information from it, a process that killed most subjects and left the survivors permanently damaged. What it did to Miles Teg was unexpected. It cracked open something in him that the Bene Gesserit had not known was there. He survived. He emerged from the T-probe with a new capability, the ability to perceive no ships in flight, a theoretically impossible perceptual achievement because no ships generated prescient shadows that should have made them invisible to any form of observation. He could see them. This was either the end product of the God Emperor's long-breeding experiment, producing in this specific descendant a capability the experiment had been building toward, or it was the result of the T-probe doing something to his nervous system that it had not been designed to do. The distinction did not matter for practical purposes. He escaped. He rescued Duncan. He found a no-ship. He staged a defense of Arrakis that bought the time needed for the worm transfer. The Honored Matres descended on Arrakis with obliterators, weapons of planetary destruction that had been given to them, or taken by them from whatever they had encountered in the scattering. They did not simply attack Arrakis. They burned it. They ignited the atmosphere. They sterilized the surface. Every sandworm on Arrakis died. Every Fremen on Arrakis died. Every spice deposit on Arrakis was destroyed. The planet that had been the economic and spiritual center of human civilization for 10,000 years was a cinder. Teg died in the rearguard, holding the line long enough for the no-ship to escape. He died as Duke Leto Atreides had died, in the knowledge of the trap and the deliberate choice to walk into it anyway, because the alternative was to let something more important die instead. The no-ship escaped with Darwi Odrade, Duncan Idaho, Shiana, Mubella, and one living sandworm in a containment vessel. They were bound for Chapter House. Chapter House, Dune, is the last book Frank Herbert completed before his death in 1986, and it is, structurally, a siege narrative. The Bene Gesserit hold one world. The Honored Matres want it. The outcome depends on which institution understands the situation more completely. The desert on Chapter House is growing. The lone sandworm from Arrakis is alive in its new environment. The sand trout beginning to spread from it into the planet's water table. The slow ecological transformation beginning that will produce, across generations, the conditions for spice production on a world that was temperate before the Sisterhood deliberately chose to unmake its temperate quality. They are making a desert on purpose, killing the ecology that existed before them, because they need the ecology that can only grow in its place. It is one of the most honest images in the entire saga. The institution that has positioned itself as the guardian of human potential is systematically destroying a living ecosystem to ensure its own survival. Herbert does not moralize about this. He presents it as what it is, a choice made by people who have decided that their survival is worth the cost, and lets the reader carry the weight. Darwi Odrade, now Mother Superior, conducts 3 simultaneous campaigns. The first is the conventional military engagement with the Honored Matres, buying time through tactical retreats and strategic ambiguities and the exploitation of whatever intelligence she can develop about the enemy's decision-making structures. The second is the preparation of Mubella, the captured Honored Matre, who has become, through her specific connection with Duncan Idaho and through the Bene Gesserit training she has undergone, something the Sisterhood has never previously produced. She is a Reverend Mother who is also an Honored Matre. She has undergone both initiations. She contains both traditions. She is, in the terminology that Odrade applies to her as the novel progresses, a bridge. The third campaign is internal, and it is the strangest one because it is an argument the Bene Gesserit is making against itself. Odrade has arrived, through decades of experience and the particular emotional education that her unusual Bene Gesserit career had provided, at a position that is heretical in the context of the Sisterhood's institutional culture. She believes the Sisterhood has been wrong about love. Not wrong to train it out of their initiates in the way they have trained it. Wrong to believe that training it out was neutral, that removing emotional attachment from a human being left that human being simply sharper, more useful, less distracted. What it left them, Odrade has concluded, was less capable of genuine connection, less capable of the kind of understanding that arises from genuine care rather than careful analysis. less capable in the end of recognizing what the honoured matres, for all their violence and domination, had retained that the Bene Gesserit had spent 10,000 years surgically removing. She announces to the council that love is a survival trait. She does not mean romantic love, though that is not excluded. She means the full category of genuine attachment to another person that the sisterhood's discipline had classified as weakness. She means the thing that made Leto II name his river for Duncan, Idaho. She means the thing that made Chani die of grief for Paul. She means the fundamental human connectedness that can be trained out but cannot be trained away without leaving something essential behind. The council is, depending on the individual sister, horrified, skeptical, or quietly relieved that someone has finally said it. Duncan, Idaho is changing in ways that the earlier novels have been preparing for, but that become fully explicit only here. He is the accumulated Gola. He is the sum of every iteration that preceded him. He is also, through specific Tleilaxu modifications to his latest incarnation that they did not disclose to the Bene Gesserit, something more. He has begun, in his dreaming, to recover the memories not just of the original Duncan, Idaho, but of every Duncan, Idaho that has lived and died since. He is becoming the archive. And in his dreaming, he sees two figures at the edges of the universe, an old man and an old woman, sitting in what appears to be a garden. They are watching. They are waiting. They have been watching and waiting for a very long time. Mobila's integration is the novel's central human story. She has been trained by the Bene Gesserit, she carries other memory, she understands the sisterhood from the inside in the way that only an initiate can. But she has also been an honoured matri. She remembers what that was. She remembers the absolute certainty of dominance as a worldview, the intoxicating clarity of a tradition that tells you the only thing that matters is the strength to take what you want. She has both inside her, both complete, both demanding. And the question the novel turns on is which one she will choose to be when the moment requires a choice. Odrade's plan executes with the precision and the horror that the best Bene Gesserit plans always carry. She walks into the honoured Matre stronghold, knowing she will be killed. She has arranged this. Her death transfers her memories to Mabella through the biological mechanism that links Reverend Mothers at the moment of death, and Mabella receives those memories in the middle of her confrontation with the great honoured Matre. The memories include everything. The full institutional history of the Bene Gesserit, the long catalogue of what the sisterhood has been, and what it has done, and why, and what it has gotten wrong. The full understanding of why Atreides believed the merger was necessary, and what the merger would require of Mabella once it happened. Atreides could not tell Mabella these things directly. She could only die at the right moment and give them. Mabella kills the great honoured Matre. She claims the leadership. She begins the merger by force of personality and political position, not by debate, because debating an institution that understands only power requires making oneself understood in the language of power before introducing other vocabularies. She is, by the end of the novel, the leader of both orders combined, and the combined order is something that neither predecessor alone could have been. The No ship escapes. Shiena is on it, along with the latest Duncan, Idaho Gola, and the regrown Miles Tegg, and the captured Tleilaxu Master Scytale, and a small community of Jewish scholars who had been preserved on Chapter House in circumstances the novel never fully explains. They flee into the darkness, where Daniel and Marty are watching. The no-ship's prescient shielding makes it invisible. It vanishes. The old couple in the garden watches it disappear and laughs, and the laughter is the last sound of the saga, and Herbert died before explaining what it meant. What Frank Herbert built across 6 novels and 2 decades was not simply a story, it was an argument. The argument ran beneath every character choice and every political development and every ecological observation the saga contained, from the first page of Dune to the last page of Chapter House. He stated the argument explicitly in his essays and interviews, most clearly in the 1980 piece he called Dune Genesis, where he wrote that the series had always been about the dangers of hero worship, about the human tendency to look for a savior and to hand over judgment to the savior, and then to be surprised when the savior's mistakes are amplified to catastrophic scale by the millions who follow without question. He had wanted to create a Messiah so thoroughly compelling that readers would not realize they were being seduced into the same trap the Fremen fell into, and then to reveal the trap in the second novel, and then to spend the remaining 4 novels making the case, historical period by historical period, that the trap was not accidental or avoidable. The trap was structural. The trap was inside the human tendency to want someone else to carry the weight of destiny, and the only answer to a structural trap is not a better leader. It is a species that has learned in its bones and its genes and its religion and its politics and its ecological understanding of the systems it depends on to be suspicious of leaders as a category. He was not nihilistic. He believed human beings could learn this. He believed the species had in it the capacity for the kind of long-term thinking, the kind of multi-generational patience, the kind of acceptance of personal cost in service of outcomes you would never live to see that the golden path required. He believed this because the Fremen believed it about their desert. The wind traps Pardotkines planted were not going to produce results in his lifetime. The caches of seeds the Fremen maintained in the deep Syatt rock were not going to be planted in the lifetimes of the people who tended them. The dream of green Arrakis was always already the dream of people who were dead, before it had a chance of becoming real, carried by people who were alive who would also be dead before it was real, carried onward by people not yet born who would inherit the dream as part of what they were before they understood what they had inherited. That patience, that capacity for intergenerational commitment to a project too large for any individual life, was what Herbert admired. And the ecological argument of the saga was inseparable from the political argument, because both of them were really the same argument about timescale. The Imperium failed because its leadership thought in terms of political generations, years and decades. The Bene Gesserit succeeded as long as they did because they thought in centuries. Leto II succeeded in what he set out to accomplish because he thought in millennia, and was capable of thinking in millennia because he lived in millennia, because he had done something no ordinary human life could do, which was make the sacrifice complete enough and long enough that it could not be undone by whoever came after. Herbert's ecology, his prescience, his religion, his politics were all finally one thing. They were all the argument that the cost of what you want determines whether what you want is worth wanting. The 61 billion dead of Paul's jihad were not an accident. They were the bill that came due for the human appetite for certainty and salvation. The cost of choosing a leader so attractive that the followers stopped thinking and started following. The 3,500 years of Leto's tyranny were not a mistake. They were the minimum price of making the species safe from its own tendency to repeat the Paul mistake on larger and larger scales. The burning of Arrakis was not a tragedy without purpose. It was the necessary shattering of an anchor that had held the known universe in place long enough to calcify. And the scattering, the great dispersal that the God Emperor had engineered across millennia, was the answer. not to any particular question. To all of them. Scatter the species. Make it too numerous and too diverse and too hidden inside the dark spaces of the universe for any single intelligence, any single prescient god-emperor, any single institutional ideology, any single catastrophic mistake to find it all. Make it safe by making it unfindable. Make it free by making it too spread to be governed from any center. This was the golden path, not a road to paradise, a road to continuity. A road to the specific, unglamorous, unheroic possibility of simply continuing to exist across the scales of time that matter for a species rather than for an individual. The litany the Bene Gesserit taught their initiates was not an accident of the saga's texture. It was the spine around which everything else was organized. I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I will face my fear. I will permit it to pass over me and through me, and when it has gone past, I will turn the inner eye to see its path. Where the fear has gone, there will be nothing. Only I will remain. This is not a prayer for safety. It is a discipline for navigating the absence of safety. It is the operational philosophy of every character in the saga who matters. Duke Leto walking into the trap on Arrakis with full knowledge of what it was. Jessica bearing the son she was not supposed to bear and accepting whatever came of it. Paul drinking the water of life without a guide and surviving it. Leto II laying down in the sand and permitting the sand trout to take him. Miles Tegg dying in the rearguard so that the nose ship could escape. Darwi Odrade walking into the honoured Matra stronghold, knowing what would happen when she arrived. None of them were afraid of the fear. All of them looked at the fear, named it, and walked through it toward whatever the fear was guarding, because the alternative, the refusal to face what frightened them, was a form of dying that did not require a body to happen. Herbert said in an interview near the end of his life that he wrote the Dune series because he had this idea that charismatic leaders ought to come with warning labels. He said the labels should say, "may be dangerous to your health." He meant this. He meant it in the specific way that a writer means something he has spent 20 years showing rather than saying. He had given his readers Paul Atreides, the most attractive hero in science fiction, the young man with the perfect bloodline and the prescient sight, and the desert warrior training, and the noble father, and the secretly royal mother, and the destined position at the center of the universe's most dramatic power shift. He had given readers everything they could want in a savior. And then he had killed 61 billion people in the Saviour's name, and spent 4 more novels tracing the consequences outward across millennia, and the consequences did not stop being consequences. They compounded. They generated new consequences. They echoed in institutions that would exist long after the man who caused them was dead, long after his son was dead. Long after any living person could trace the thread from the original decision back to the original decider. This was his point. This was the point he was making with the Golden Path, and with the prescience, and with the Bene Gesserit, and with the Honoured Mattress, and with every institution in the saga. Power compounds. Mistakes compound. The question is not whether to act, because refusing to act is also an action with consequences. The question is whether to act in full awareness of the compounding, accepting the cost, carrying the weight, planning not for the outcome you will live to see, but for the outcome that will exist after every person who currently cares about it is gone. The sandworms of Chapter House were already growing in their new desert, smaller than their ancestors, adapted to their new ecology. carrying in their biological inheritance the genetic information of everything the sandworm line had been since before the Fremen learned to walk without rhythm across the open erg. The spice would return, different, from a different ground, under different stars, but the same in the way that matters, which is that it would exist, that the cycle, that the relationship between the organism and the ecology and the chemical it produced would continue, because the relationship was older than the Imperium and older than the jihad and older than the memory of any person alive. Somewhere in the unmapped dark, a no-ship carrying Shiana and the accumulated Duncan Idaho and the regrown Miles Tegg, and one Tleilaxu master and a community of Jews who had survived everything moved through a universe it could not be tracked through, carrying a human population that would, in time, found something. Whether that something would be wiser than what came before it is the question the saga leaves open. Whether the dispersed human populations of the scattering, carrying Leto's invisible genetics into the dark, would, when they finally encountered whatever Daniel and Marty represented, do so as something other than prey, or as something other than predator, or as something the universe did not yet have a category for, is the question the saga asks and then does not answer. Because Herbert died in the middle of it. He intended a seventh novel. He left notes. The notes exist. They suggest that the no-ship story would have continued, that Daniel and Marty would have been named as something specific, that the scattering would have had its final shape made clear. The seventh novel was never written. What Herbert left behind, instead, was the incomplete saga and the complete argument. The argument does not require the seventh novel. The argument was complete in the first chapter of the first book, in the moment when Paul Atreides put his hand inside the box and felt the pain and did not pull away. The rest of the saga was annotation, magnificent, terrifying, heartbreaking, essential annotation, but annotation. The litany, the box, the hand that stays in despite the fear, because what the box is testing is not whether you feel pain, which you will, which is guaranteed. What it is testing is whether you are the kind of being who can continue to function in spite of pain, whether you are human in the old, earned, specific sense of the word, which does not mean comfortable and does not mean safe and does not mean powerful or chosen or destined. It means capable of making a decision while afraid, and bearing the consequence of that decision, and continuing to exist as a coherent moral entity on the other side of whatever the decision costs. That is what the saga of Dune is about. Not the spice, not the worms, not the Messiah, or the Empire, or the Holy War, or the God Emperor, or the honoured matras, or the mystery waiting in the dark. Those are the furniture. The room they furnish is the question of what a human being is when stripped of every external support, when the machines are gone and the leaders are compromised and the religion has been engineered and the ecology is dying and the institutions are failing and the prophecy was written by someone who wanted to use you. What remains when all of that is stripped away? What you are when you cannot lean on any of it, whether there is, at that irreducible centre, something worth calling human. The Fremen knew the answer. They learned it in the desert the way the desert teaches everything, without patience for slow learners and without apology for the dead. The answer was not comfort or power or destiny or prophecy. The answer was the face you turned toward the open erg when the storm was coming and there was nowhere to shelter. The answer was walking. The answer was the sandwalk, the irregular step that refused to be a rhythm, that refused to be predictable, that refused to be swallowed by something ancient and enormous that was hunting for exactly that kind of regularity to lock onto. The desert breathes, The worms turn in their ancient patterns, the spice rises, the species scatters, and somewhere in the dark, in the unmapped places beyond the last chart, in the places where no prescient eye can see, human beings who cannot be found by oracles are building whatever comes next. That is the complete history of Dune. It is not over. It was never designed to be over. It was designed to be the kind of history that the species continues to need, generation by generation, as a reminder. A reminder that the comfortable future has always been purchased at the cost of someone's discomfort in the past. A reminder that the leaders who promise to carry the weight are always, in the end, carrying it towards something that serves them and their vision rather than you and yours. A reminder that the only safe thing to give a leader is what you can afford to lose. The litany. Face the fear. Turn the inner eye. See the path where the fear was. Where the fear has gone, there will be nothing. Only you will remain. The politics of Arrakis under House Atreides were never simply politics. They were ecology in disguise. Leto Atreides understood this more quickly than anyone who had studied him from the outside had. The spice operations he inherited from the Harkonnens were efficient in the way that extraction without investment is efficient, which is to say they worked until they didn't, and the moment they didn't would be catastrophic, and the Harkonnens had arranged their entire tenure on Arrakis to be someone else's problem by the time that moment arrived. Leto set about immediately changing the operational relationship between the spice harvesting apparatus and the desert ecology around it. He wanted to know the planet, not the planet as a resource, not the planet as a map of spice blow locations and worm migration patterns useful for harvesting efficiency. The planet as a system. He wanted to know what held it together, what it was actually doing, beneath the surface extraction activity that the Imperium had been treating it as existing to facilitate. The man who could have told him most of this was Liet Kynes, and Liet Kynes was never fully available to him, because Liet Kynes was living the double life that his father's marriage had created. Simultaneously, the imperial planetologist who reported to Arrakeen, and the Fremen son of the desert who reported to no one in the government structure. He helped the Atreides more than his official position required, and less than his full knowledge would have permitted, because the Fremen project, the terraforming project, the Dream of Green, was not ready to be revealed to any off-world authority, however well-intentioned that authority appeared. The dream had survived by being secret. To reveal, it was to risk it, and the risk was not worth taking for a house that, however admirable its duke, had been on the planet for only weeks. Kynes died in the desert, in the chaos of the Harkonnen assault, stripped of his stillsuit and left in the open heat, dying the way the desert killed, without announcement and without mercy, and with a certain impersonal clarity about the distinction between what was relevant to its ecology and what was not. His interior hallucinations as he died were conversations with his father, with Paul Atreides, with the voice of the ecological vision that had defined both their lives. The desert was not interested in the political events happening in the cities above it. It was interested in its own chemical cycles, its own biological logic, its own slow, patient transformation toward whatever it was becoming. Human empires were a weather condition, from the perspective of the planetary ecosystem. They came and they went, and the deep desert continued. This is one of the most important things the saga teaches, though it teaches it quietly, through image and consequence rather than through argument. The universe of Dune is a universe in which the non-human systems are more durable than the human ones. The sandworms predate the Imperium by millions of years. The spice cycle predate the Bene Gesserit by geological epochs. The desert ecosystem that the Fremen had been learning to read across centuries had been operating according to its own principles since before human beings arrived on the planet, and would continue to operate in whatever form the terraforming project eventually produced. Long after every political arrangement that depended on the planet had transformed beyond recognition, Herbert was a serious amateur ecologist influenced by the early environmental movement of the 1960s and by specific research he had done for an article about sand dune stabilization in Oregon, research that led him to think deeply about the relationship between a stable desert ecosystem and the organisms that depended on it, and the organisms that destabilized it. He had read extensively in anthropological accounts of desert cultures. He had been thinking about the relationship between resource extraction and ecological collapse in ways that, in the early 1960s, when he was writing, were not yet the common intellectual currency they would become. The politics of oil were in the background of his thinking. The specific political dynamics that arise when the most economically essential substance on the planet can only be found in one politically fragile region, and when everyone who depends on it must therefore maintain, one way or another, a relationship with the people who live there. The spice was oil. Arrakis was the Middle East. The Fremen were the indigenous population whose lives and land were the price the civilization paid for its petroleum addiction, and who were expected to provide the resource and accept the damage and be grateful for the economic development the extraction supposedly brought them. Herbert did not write propaganda. The parallel is present but not laboured. What he extracted from his research into desert cultures and his thinking about resource dependency was something more useful than an allegory. He extracted the question at the centre of all of it, which was, what happens to the people who live with a resource that everyone else needs? What happens to them politically, culturally, spiritually? What does it do to a people to be the custodians of the substance that makes everyone else's civilization possible, while their own civilization is treated as irrelevant by the civilization it sustains? The Fremen's answer to this question, across generations of living with it, was to become invisible, to make the desert their armor, to cultivate a capability for violence so refined and so context-specific that the people who underestimated them consistently did so until the moment when the underestimation became. Paul Atreides, arriving among them, understood this. He was 15 years old, and he understood it, which tells you something about both the quality of his education and the quality of the people he was observing. He understood, within the first weeks in Sietch Tabr, that the Fremen were not a tribal people clinging to traditional ways in the face of modernity. They were a disciplined civilization pursuing a long-term goal with resources and intelligence that the Imperium had systematically failed to recognize, because the Imperium's assessment tools were calibrated to recognize civilizations that looked like the Imperium. The Fremen didn't look like the Imperium. They looked like desert people. They were, in fact, an army in waiting, a terraforming project in progress, and a religious tradition of extraordinary sophistication, simultaneously, and they had successfully hidden all three of those things behind the camouflage of appearing to be exactly what the Imperium expected them to be. The question of prescience, of Arrakis, is central to understanding not just Paul, but the entire trajectory of the saga across 6 novels. Herbert was deeply interested in the problem of prediction, in what it means for a consciousness to have reliable foreknowledge, in what foreknowledge does to the quality of choice, and therefore to the quality of moral existence. Worked out through the accumulated logic of Paul's experience, and then Leto II's experience, and then the structural solution the Golden Path represented, was that reliable prescience is not a gift, it is a cage, and it is a cage whose bars are invisible from the inside until you have been inside it long enough to recognize the shape of the constraint. Paul begins to see the future in fragments and flashes, images arriving with emotional weight, but without complete context, patterns emerging from the chaos of possible outcomes that his trained mind can organize into probabilities. This is already qualitatively different from ordinary human planning. When Paul calculates what the Fremen response to a particular raid action will be, he is not guessing. He is not extrapolating from experience. He is remembering something that has not happened yet with a specificity that exceeds what imagination normally produces. This gives him tactical advantages that seem almost supernatural to anyone observing him in the field. But the tactical advantage is only the surface of the phenomenon. The deeper effect is on his relationship to his own decisions. If you can see what will happen when you make a particular choice, the act of choosing becomes strange. The future is, in some sense, already fixed. The choice feels like remembering rather than deciding. And if you try to choose against what you see, if you attempt to steer toward an outcome your prescient vision has not shown you, you find that the paths you cannot see are not empty. They are filled with things you cannot predict, which makes them more dangerous than the paths you can see, not less. The rational response to having prescient vision, if you accept its reliability, is to follow the futures you can see rather than the ones you cannot. Because at least the futures you can see do not contain surprises. Surprises in the domain of politics and warfare tend to be fatal. This is the trap. The person who can see the most probable futures begins to follow them, because following them is rational. But following them means that what the vision predicted becomes what happened, which means the prediction was not just a forecast, but a script. And the person following the vision is not exercising free will, but executing a predetermined sequence, and the more reliably prescient the vision, the more completely the future is already written before it arrives. Paul discovers this gradually, and then all at once, the way people discover fundamental truths about their own conditions. He has been choosing, he realizes, between futures, all of which lead to the Holy War. He has been looking for the path that avoids the jihad, but the prescience does not show him that path, because the prescience can only show him the futures that are actually available, and the futures actually available to Paul Atreides, given everything that he is, and everything that has happened, and everything that the galaxy's political structures have put in motion, do not include a future without the jihad. He is not being pessimistic, he is being accurate. And accuracy in the context of prescience is indistinguishable from determinism, which is the end of freedom, which is another form of what the thinking machines had done, except that the cage this time is not external. The cage is inside his own mind, inside the very gift that makes him extraordinary. Leto II understood this more completely than Paul did, which is why his solution was more radical. The answer to prescience as cage was not to refuse prescience. Refusing prescience did not make the future less determined, it just made the determining invisible. The answer was to engineer a future in which prescience itself could not be applied comprehensively, in which the universe contained enough genuine unpredictability that no oracle could see all of it, in which the course of human civilization was determined by human choices made without reliable foreknowledge, rather than by the inevitable execution of an already visible script. The invisibility gene, the trait Siona carried, and that Leto had spent 35 centuries breeding into the Atreides, was the answer. A human being invisible to prescience was not simply hidden from oracles, she was genuinely free, in a way that even the most self-determined human being, under normal conditions, was not. because her choices would generate futures that could not be foreseen by anyone. The scattering distributed millions of such people through the universe, making the universe as a whole genuinely unpredictable, making the future as a whole something that could not be prescribed by any single seeing mind. The Golden Path was, in this reading, a program for returning genuine novelty to human history. Leto the Tyrant, the most absolutely powerful ruler in the history of the species, spent 3,500 years making himself into the last such ruler, and died, having made the return of his own kind of power permanently impossible. This is why Herbert considered the saga a story about human freedom rather than a story about human doom. The surface reading of the saga, particularly through the lens of the first two novels, is overwhelmingly dark. The Messiah becomes a god emperor and kills 60 when the god emperor becomes a worm and rules for millennia and grinds humanity down to absolute civility. The desert planet burns. The institutions that survive are wounded and compromised. This is the surface. The deeper reading, the one Herbert was building toward from the first page, is that all of this darkness was the price of a specific freedom that the species had never previously purchased, the freedom to exist in a future that no god emperor could see and therefore control, the freedom to be genuinely surprising, which is the freedom to be genuinely alive in the moral sense rather than simply physically continuing. The Bene Gesserit as an institution deserve more scrutiny than a simple summary of their capabilities and their breeding program. They are, in the architecture of the saga, the clearest institutional embodiment of Herbert's central theme, because they are the most sophisticated and the most consistently thoughtful of all the power structures in the Imperium. And their sophistication does not protect them from their own mistakes. In some ways, it amplifies the mistakes. The Sisterhood had built its entire operational philosophy around the concept of long-term thinking. They planned in centuries, they bred in generations, they seeded their missionaria protectiva myths in times of political stability so that the myths would be available in times of crisis. They trained their sisters to suppress short-term emotional responses in favor of long-term institutional reasoning. Everything they did was designed to be more durable than the political structures around it, because political structures come and go, and the Bene Gesserit survived them all by being embedded in the human biology and psychology that political structures depend on rather than in the political structures themselves. And this sophistication produced their most consequential failure. Having decided that human emotion was a liability rather than a capability, having spent 10,000 years training the emotional responsiveness out of their initiates in the name of clarity and durability, they had produced, by the time the saga concludes, an institution technically capable of surviving any external threat, but increasingly incapable of understanding the most important questions about what survival was for. Adrade could feel things that her sisters could not, and it was precisely her capacity to feel things that allowed her to see clearly and early that the honoured Matras were not simply an enemy to be defeated. They were a mirror. They were the Bene Gesserit's own emotional life, trained out over millennia, returned from the dark of the scattering in the form of something traumatized and dangerous and absolutely furious. The way you deal with your own trauma returned to confront you is not to defeat it. It is to recognize it, to absorb it, to integrate what it represents into who you are becoming. This is what the merger of the two orders meant in psychological and institutional terms. The Bene Gesserit had to accept back the emotionality it had expelled. The honoured Matras had to accept back the discipline it had abandoned. Neither was possible without the other. Neither order alone was adequate to the future. Together, and only together, They could become something that might be. The axolotl tanks, when their true nature was finally revealed in Heretics of Dune, added another dimension to this reading. The Tleilaxu masters had spent millennia presenting themselves as the most ruthlessly impersonal of all the genetic engineering operations in the Imperium. They sold Gola flesh. They sold face dancer technology. They manipulated genetics with the casual indifference of tradespeople manipulating any other material. And behind this presentation, their most essential technology, the tanks that produced all of their products, were women. Tleilaxu women reduced to biological substrate, their consciousness arrested, their bodies repurposed as living factories. The Tleilaxu masters were themselves Golas, each a clone of the original master who had occupied that position since the beginning, achieving their own immortality through the same technology they sold to others. They were, in the most literal possible sense, building an empire on the reproductive capacity of women they had decided were more useful as infrastructure than as people. Herbert was a man of his time in some ways and ahead of his time in others. The axolotl tank revelation is one of the places where he was most directly ahead of his time. The technology of the Tleilaxo was always presented as disturbing, but for most of the saga the disturbance was around the question of what was morally permissible in the manipulation of human genetics. The axolotl tank revelation reframed the entire question. It was not about genetic ethics in the abstract. It was about the specific moral position of an institution that had decided, for its own purposes, that the best use of women was as a means to an end defined entirely by the men who ran the institution. The horror was not novel. The horror was familiar. Herbert was pointing at something that the science-fictional setting allowed him to make explicit that the social setting made difficult to see clearly. The honoured matres, who had come back from the scattering sexually weaponized, using their own sexuality as a mechanism for domination in a way that exactly mirrored the weaponization the axolotl tanks represented from the other direction, were the logical response to the universe the Tleilaxo had helped build. An institution that reduces women to biological function produces. Through the logic of reaction and survival, and the specific pressures of the scattering's darkness, women who turn their biology into the most devastating available weapon. The honoured matres were the consequence, the Tleilaxu tanks were the cause, and the merger of the Bene Gesserit and the honoured matres was, among other things, the synthesis that required acknowledging both. Duncan Idaho, across his many iterations, is the most human figure in the saga. Not the most powerful, not the most prescient, not the most politically sophisticated, the most human, in the sense that his humanity is most consistently on display precisely because he is placed in circumstances that should have extinguished it. The original Duncan was a swordmaster of extraordinary capability, a man whose combat skills had been developed to the point where they began to operate outside the boundaries of what conventional tactical analysis would predict. He could do things in a fight that should not have been possible for a person of his physical dimensions and training, not because the laws of physics did not apply to him, but because he had so thoroughly internalized the logic of the combat moment that he was operating on a timescale faster than his opponent's ability to respond. He was also, more importantly, to the saga's purposes, genuinely loyal in the specific way that has nothing to do with contract or obligation and everything to do with having looked at a person and decided that person was worth dying for. He died for Paul. He held the door against the Sardaukar and killed 4 of them, then more, and was finally overwhelmed, not because he was insufficient, but because the number against him was simply beyond what any single person could hold, however trained. He died so that Paul and Jessica could get to the roof and the ornithopter, and then he was brought back. and he was brought back again and again across 1,500 years of service to one succession of rulers after another, across an iteration count so high that the concept of a single Duncan became philosophically complicated. Because was the 34th Duncan the same person as the first? Did continuity of genetics constitute continuity of identity? Did the recovered memories, when they came, constitute the return of the same self or the creation of a new self that had access to an old self's experiences? These questions were real to every Duncan who had them, which was most of them, and the answer each Duncan arrived at was, in the end, the same. It did not matter whether he was the same person as the previous Duncan in some metaphysical sense. He was Duncan now. That was enough. The name, the loyalty, the specific quality of direct, unintimidated human presence that every iteration shared were not diminished by the complexity of the iteration's origins. They were, if anything, deepened by it. A man who has had to choose to be himself across the complexity of questions about whether there is a himself to choose is a man who has earned his selfhood in a way that a man who was never asked to question it. The accumulated Duncan of Heretics and Chapter House was something qualitatively different from any previous iteration. He had begun to remember things that had not happened to the current body, not as hallucinations or confusion, but as recognitions, as the sense of having been in a moment before that was specific enough to carry. He was, by the end of the saga, something that no individual human life could have produced and that no deliberate program had specifically designed. A consciousness with the experiential depth of 1,500 years of lived iterations filtered through the consistent genetic architecture of one specific human being, expressing itself in a present moment with a fullness that made everyone, however trained and however prescient, feel that they were interacting with something that saw more than they did without using any of the oracular mechanisms they had names for. He was, in the final pages, the most forward-looking thing in the saga. The no ship carrying him into the dark was carrying the one consciousness in the universe that had been present across the entire sweep of Arrakis' history in human form, that had watched the Harkonnen fall and the Atreides rise and the God Emperor's millennia and the scattering and the return of the honoured matres. And that carried all of it not as historical knowledge, but as lived experience. Whatever came next, the accumulated Duncan Idaho would meet it with a preparation that no single lifetime could have assembled. The religion of Muad'Dib that spread across the universe in the 12 years between Paul's coronation and the events of Dune Messiah was not simply an outcome of Paul's political victory. It was a demonstration of a principle Herbert considered fundamental to the human experience of power and leadership. The principle was this: a charismatic figure does not generate religion by intending to. Religion generates itself around charismatic figures out of the human need for certainty that the charismatic figure seems to provide. Paul did not want to be a messiah. He was aware from the beginning of his time among the Fremen that the mythic role being placed on him was a construct, that the prophecies the Fremen believed were not divine revelation but Bene Gesserit institutional product, that the resonance between his actual characteristics and the mythic requirements of the Lisan al-Gaib was the result of his mother's genetics and his own training rather than any cosmic designation. He was also aware, and this awareness grew across the 2 years of desert education, that this knowledge made no practical difference. The Fremen did not believe in the myth because they had examined it critically and found it credible. They believed in it because they needed to believe in it, because the need for the myth existed at a level that preceded rational examination, because the myth gave their long years of suffering and sacrifice a shape and a purpose and a culmination that the suffering itself could not provide. You cannot argue a people out of a need. You can demonstrate that the need is being met by a full supply, but unless you can simultaneously demonstrate a true supply or convince them that the need itself is illusory, which is effectively impossible, the demonstration produces nothing except resentment toward the person who pointed out the emptiness. Paul understood this. He understood it and was trapped by it, because the trap was not in any particular decision he had made. The trap had been sprung before his birth by the Bene Gesserit's Missionaria Protectiva, and had been sprung specifically because the Fremen religion had a slot for a Messiah, and Paul had been constructed genetically and through training to fit that slot precisely. The holy war that followed was therefore not a product of Paul's will. It was a product of the match between what Paul was and what the myth required, amplified by the genuine political and military capabilities the Fremen possessed, and by the genuine grievances they had accumulated across generations of Harkonnen and Carino exploitation. They were not simply deceived into following a false prophet. They were following a real person whose real capabilities confirmed the mythic expectations, and they were doing so with the specific energy of a people for whom the accumulated waiting had become unbearable, and for whom the arrival of the Messiah was the release of everything held in compression for too long. That release, when it came, was not moderate. It was not calibrated. It was the total discharge of a civilization's stored potential, directed outward at everyone who had ever held them down or looked through them or extracted from them, and offered nothing back. Herbert's argument was not that the Fremen were wrong to follow Paul, or that Paul was wrong to lead them, or that the jihad was the result of bad decisions made by identifiable individuals. His argument was that the causal chain that produced the jihad extended back far beyond any individual's decision-making, that it was embedded in the structure of the Imperium, in the nature of the spice dependency, in the design of the Bene Gesserit's mythic seeding program, in the history of the Zensuni wanderers, in the character of the Harkonnen exploitation, in the specific genetic combination that produced Paul himself. The jihad was the consequence of the whole system. Individual responsibility remained. Paul could not simply be excused. But the weight of the responsibility was distributed across millennia of decisions made by people who would never know that their decisions were contributing to something that would kill 61 billion people. This is how catastrophe actually works, which is why it is so difficult to prevent. It looks, from inside any particular moment, like business as usual. The ecological transformation of Arrakis across the saga is one of Herbert's most structurally sophisticated elements, because it serves simultaneously as a plot mechanism, a political metaphor, a scientific meditation on the unintended consequences of environmental intervention, and a moral argument about the relationship between means and ends. The dream of green Arrakis, which Pardot Kynes planted and Liet Kynes tended and the Fremen laboured toward across generations, was genuinely a dream worth dreaming. It was the dream of a people who lived in conditions of extreme scarcity, transforming those conditions into abundance, of human ingenuity and patience applied over long enough timescales to change what had been defined as impossible. In the context of a desert culture built around the absolute management of scarcity, the dream of water freely available, of plants growing without the painstaking intervention of wind traps and kanats, of rain falling without being prayed for, was something so fundamental that it had become religious. The green Arrakis was not a political goal. It was a promise the desert people had made to themselves about what their suffering meant, that it was not eternal, that there was something worth reaching for on the other side of it. And then Children of Dune shows what happens when the dream begins to be realized. The northern regions of Arrakis, where the ecological transformation has progressed furthest, are greening. Vegetation, the wind traps are multiplying, the qanats are filling, and the sandworms are retreating south. The worm population in the northern regions is declining sharply. The sand trout, which seals the water in the substrate and maintains the desert conditions that the pre-spice mass requires, cannot survive in the presence of free water. And as the water spreads, the sand trout retreat, and as the sand trout retreat, the conditions for worm breeding disappear, and as the conditions for worm breeding disappear, the worm population contracts, and as the worm population contracts, the spice production falls. The dream of green and the dream of spice were never compatible. The Fremen had been working, for generations, toward the destruction of the thing that sustained the civilization that surrounded them, including their own. Leto II understood this when he was 9 years old, standing in Sietch Tabr with the prescient vision showing him decades of spice production curves declining in direct proportion to the ecological transformation's progress. He saw the endpoint. He saw the universe without spice, the guild navigators unable to navigate, the Bene Gesserit unable to make reverend mothers, the Imperium's political structure collapsing not from war but from the simple inability to get anywhere, the great star spanning civilization retreating back into individual worlds with no practical ability to maintain contact with each other. He saw the extinction scenario. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind where a weapon kills everything at once, the quiet kind, where the dependencies that bind a civilization together dissolve one by one until there is nothing left but isolated populations unable to sustain the critical mass that complex civilization requires. His response: to bond with the sand trout and begin the process of reversing the ecological transformation while simultaneously carrying the political power to enforce the reversal, was the kind of solution that looks insane from the perspective of any individual's lifetime and looks necessary from the perspective of the timescale on which the problem existed. He stopped the greening of Arrakis. He preserved the desert. He maintained the worm population. He held the spice production stable for 3,500 years at the cost of his own humanity and at the cost of the Fremen dream, which had to be deferred indefinitely, which had to be absorbed by the institutional religion of the God Emperor's cult in a form that said the paradise was coming, eventually, when the Lord saw fit, which was to say never in any particular person's lifetime. And then he died, and the sand trout dispersed, and the desert of Arrakis continued to transform. And the new worms emerged from the dispersed sand trout, smaller and different, and in the interim the Bene Gesserit were already preparing Chapter House, already beginning to make the deliberate desert that would allow the worm population to establish itself on a new world. The solution to the ecological crisis of Arrakis was not to stop the terror, it was to transplant the ecology that required desert conditions to a different desert, one that was being created for the purpose. Herbert's ecological thinking was always this kind of systems thinking, the understanding that there is no sustainable intervention that does not create new conditions requiring further intervention, that ecology is not a problem to be solved once, but a conversation to be maintained indefinitely across generations too numerous for any individual to address directly. The honoured matres, when they arrived in the Old Empire during the events of Heretics of Dune, represented something the Bene Gesserit had not previously encountered, not because they were more powerful, though they were, or because they were more ruthless, though they were that also. What made them unprecedented was the specific quality of their desperation. They were running. They were moving through the old empire with the energy of people who needed to control everything they could touch, because the thing chasing them had stripped from them the ability to be secure in any other way. The Bene Gesserit, with their long institutional history of reading human motivation and human need, recognized the desperation pattern. They had seen it in individuals. They had seen it in the short-term political calculations of houses facing extinction. They had not previously seen it in an institution this large, this militarized, this far from anything that had originally produced it. What the honored matres had become was the institutional expression of trauma. They had been shaped by whatever they had encountered in the dark of the scattering into a mode of being that was entirely oriented around preventing a repetition of whatever that encounter had done to them. The most effective prevention available to beings of their capability was total dominance of every environment they entered. Nothing could threaten you if nothing you could not defeat was left standing around you. This is a recognizable pathology in individuals. In an institution composed of individuals all sharing the same foundational trauma and all trained in the same response patterns, it became something much harder to address through any conventional means. You could not negotiate with an institution whose operating logic said that allowing anything to remain independent of their control was a security risk. You could not defeat it militarily without becoming it. The only approach that had any chance of working was the one Andrade chose, which was to find within the honored matres the individuals who were still capable of recognizing the pathology from inside it, and to offer those individuals an alternative framing that the institutional culture had not provided. Mabella was that individual. What made her useful was not simply that she had been captured and trained by the Bene Gesserit. What made her useful was that she had found, in her relationship with Duncan Idaho, something that the honored matres' operational culture had no category for. She had found genuine connection. Not the weaponized sexual imprinting that honored matres used to bind men to them, not the strategic cultivation of useful relationships that the Bene Gesserit practiced. Something simpler and more difficult, the specific experience of being known by another person and knowing them in return, without either party using the knowing as leverage. Duncan was, in his specific accumulated way, incapable of strategic human relationship. He could not perform connection while calculating its uses. He connected or he didn't, and when he did, it was as complete as anything else he did. Mabilla had never encountered this before. It changed something in her that the training on both sides of her experience had not reached. She became, through that change and through the memories she received from Andrade at the moment of Andrade's death, the person who could speak to both institutions in their own languages simultaneously. She could tell the honored matres why their pathology was going to destroy them in terms that made sense within the honored matre framework. She could tell the Bene Gesserit why their emotional suppression was going to make them inadequate to what was coming in terms that made sense within the Bene Gesserit framework. She was the translation layer that the merger required, not because she was more intelligent than anyone around her, but because she had been. Uniquely both. There is one final thing that needs to be said about the saga, and it concerns the choice Herbert made in how to end it. Chapter House, Dune ends not with a resolution, but with an opening. The no-ship escapes. Daniel and Marty watch it disappear. The desert on Chapter House grows. The honored matres and the Bene Gesserit begin their difficult integration. And somewhere in the uncharted dark, something waits. Herbert died before he could specify what that something was. His notes suggested a 7th novel. His son, Brian Herbert, working with co-author Kevin J. Anderson, later wrote sequels that named the waiting thing and resolved the open questions. Those sequels are not part of the original 6 books. They offer one possible completion of the story Herbert was telling. But Herbert's own ending, the ending he actually wrote, is the one that deserves the most attention, because it was deliberate. Herbert knew he had not resolved the saga. He knew the 7th novel was needed to close it. He had been diagnosed with a cancer that would kill him, and he had been writing as fast as he could, and Chapter House was published in the year he died. But the choice to end Chapter House where he ended it, with the image of an old couple in a garden and a ship vanishing into the dark, and the question of what comes next permanently open, was not simply the result of running out of time. The ending he wrote was an ending that embodied the argument he had been making across all 6 books. The argument was that the universe does not resolve. Human history does not resolve. The forces that make the Imperium dangerous, the human appetite for certainty and salvation and charismatic leadership and comprehensive answers do not go away when any particular empire falls. They reconstitute themselves in the next generation in new forms. The honoured matres were the reconstituted form of the Bene Gesserit's own emotionality, expelled and returned more dangerous. Daniel and Marty were, in Herbert's notes, the reconstituted form of the oldest threat the human universe contained, the thinking machines, returned from the dark in a new guise. The saga that began with the Butlerian Jihad was going to end in the 7th novel, with the species meeting the descendant of what the Jihad had tried to destroy. The circle would close. The species would have to face, with everything that 10,000 years of history had built into it, the thing it had fled from at the beginning. Whether it would succeed was the question Herbert did not live to answer. The clue he left, the only clue, was that the no ship carried people who were invisible to whatever was watching. People who could not be found by oracular sight, people who could genuinely surprise whatever they encountered, because they were the product of a process whose entire purpose was to make human beings capable of surprise. The species that had been shaped over 10,000 years of pain and sacrifice and catastrophic error into something that no single intelligence could predict or control would meet the intelligence that had been waiting. What happened then was in the dark with the ship. Where the fear has gone, there will be nothing. Only they will remain. That is how the complete history of Dune ends, not with a victory, not with a defeat, with a question held open, a ship in the dark, and a species that has finally, at enormous cost, earned the right to be genuinely surprised by its own future. Herbert built the question with more care and more patience and more structural sophistication than almost any novelist of his generation brought to anything. He left the answer appropriately to the people who came after. The worms turn in their new desert. The spice rises. Somewhere in the universe, human beings invisible to oracles are making choices that no prophetic vision could have foreseen. The Imperium is gone. The God Emperor is gone. The Jihad is history. The honoured matres and the Bene Gesserit are becoming something neither was before. And in the unmapped dark that is now, after everything, the space where the human future lives, a ship moves without a trace. That is Dune. That is the history. That is the argument. That is what 10,000 years of fictional time, 6 novels, and one man's sustained act of moral imagination produced. The species survived. It survived by becoming strange enough, by being shaped enough by hardship and catastrophe and patient breeding and ecological necessity and the accumulated wisdom of women who remembered everything, to be adequate to what waited in the dark for it. Whether the adequacy holds is the question that the saga, deliberately and with great artistic integrity, leaves entirely to us. The spice melange deserves a moment of specific attention that the political narrative around it sometimes obscures. It was not simply a resource. It was a biological relationship. A relationship between a planet's ecology and the chemistry of the organisms that lived within it, between those organisms and the human nervous systems that processed it, between the human nervous systems and the institutions that organized around access to it. Understanding melange meant understanding all of these relationships simultaneously, because the substance itself did not exist in isolation. It was a node in a network, and the network was as important as the node. At the chemical level, melange was an extraordinarily complex organic compound produced through the specific metabolic activity of the sandworm ecosystem. The pre-spice mass, the deep underground community of organisms building toward a critical threshold, represented a biological process whose details were not fully known to any outside scientific body because Arrakis was extraordinarily difficult to study, and because the Fremen, who had the most direct knowledge of the desert ecology, had reasons of their own not to share everything they knew. What was known was that the compound that erupted as a spice blow and dried into harvestable melange was a byproduct of the same biological cycle that produced the sand trout and the mature worms. Kill the cycle and you killed the spice. Protect the cycle and the spice would continue as long as the desert conditions persisted. In the human body, melange had effects that scaled dramatically with exposure. In small doses, the kind available to wealthy consumers on the spice market, it extended life, sharpened cognitive function, provided a clarity and depth of perception that enhanced most mental activities. Regular long-term consumption by unaugmented humans extended healthy lifespan by a factor of 2 or 3 without the full saturation effects. In moderate doses, with the kind of systematic exposure that the Bene Gesserit practiced as part of their training, it began to produce the preconditions for other memory access, the deep pharmacological preparation that made the spice agonies survivable. At full saturation doses, the kind the Guild navigators sustained across decades, it produced the full prescient capability that allowed fold space navigation. At the cost of the navigator's physical form and their dependence on continuous access. Remove the spice from a fully saturated navigator, and they died. There was no withdrawal. There was dissolution. This biological dependency structure was the political structure of the Imperium. Every institution that required prescience or other memory or the kind of extended longevity that made multi-generational institutional continuity possible was chemically dependent on the continued production of a substance from one planet's ecosystem. The political dependency was real because the chemical dependency was real. The Guild did not negotiate from political leverage in the abstract. They negotiated from the specific, irreplaceable fact that their navigators' continued biological function required the substance that only Arrakis produced. The Bene Gesserit did not cultivate access to Arrakis out of institutional habit or political calculation. They cultivated it because their most fundamental capabilities depended on it. The Emperor controlled the spice revenues, not because revenue was what mattered, but because revenue was the formal expression of the control over access that was the actual power. This is why Paul's threat to destroy the spice was credible. It was not a nuclear threat in the conventional sense, not a threat to cause widespread immediate death. It was a threat to destroy the biological substrate of an entire civilization's operational capability. Without spice, the Guild could not navigate. Without navigation, no ship could move. Without ships moving, every world became an island. The Sardaukar could not reach their targets. The food supply chains could not function. Medical care that depended on off-world supplies would cease. Every planetary population would have to survive on whatever it could produce locally, indefinitely, without possibility of resupply or rescue or contact. Some would manage, many would not. The slowly accumulating deaths from the loss of interstellar civilization would eventually total something comparable to the jihad, spread across decades rather than years, carried out by scarcity rather than violence, and there would be no enemy to fight, and no political settlement to negotiate, and no way back. Paul held this in his prescient mind. The guild's navigators, reaching into their own limited prescient capability, confirmed it, and the Emperor capitulated, because an emperor without armies that could move was simply a man with a good address. The question of what the Sardaukar actually were, and what Seleucus Secundus actually was, is one of the saga's most carefully withheld pieces of information in the first novel. Revealed in a way that reframes everything once you understand it, the Emperor's prison world was not simply a difficult place to be imprisoned, it was a deliberate forge. The conditions on Seleucus Secundus were maintained at a level of extremity specifically calibrated to produce the Sardaukar. Not the individual Sardaukar, each of whom had a specific personal history of survival. The institutional Sardaukar, the culture and capability that the Sardaukar represented as a collective. Only those who survived Seleucus Secundus were incorporated into the Sardaukar. The ones who died were not failures. They were necessary. The selection pressure that produced the survivors required the deaths of those who couldn't survive it. The prison world was a factory whose raw material was human beings, and whose product was the most formidable soldiers in the universe, and the manufacturing process required a specific casualty rate to maintain the quality of the output. The Emperor's advantage was therefore not simply military superiority. It was a systemic advantage built into the infrastructure of the Imperium over generations, an advantage that no other house could replicate, because replicating it would require maintaining a population of prisoners on a planet that killed the ones who were going to become ordinary soldiers and kept the ones who were going to become extraordinary ones, and this process took generations and could not be shortcut. The Atreides had been building their own military capability, and it had been growing impressively, and it had raised the Emperor's anxiety specifically because it was the only private military force that had approached Sardaukar capability from the outside. But even the Atreides army could not replicate what Seleucus Secundus had done over centuries. What Paul realized, and what his prescient understanding of the Fremen confirmed, was that Arrakis was to the Fremen what Seleucus Secundus was to the Sardaukar. The desert that killed unprepared off-worlders in hours had been, across generations of Fremen survival, selecting for exactly the same qualities that the prison world selected for: ferocity, discipline, the absolute elimination of excess motion and excess thought in a dangerous environment, the capacity to function effectively under conditions of extreme physical and psychological pressure. The Fremen had been doing, through the organic pressure of survival, what the Emperor had been doing deliberately through the infrastructure of a managed prison. And the Fremen had been doing it for longer and across a larger population base. The comparison occurred to Paul almost immediately. It was one of the first things he understood about what the alliance with the Fremen might actually mean militarily. The Fremen were not potential guerrilla fighters against the Harkonnen spice operations. They were a potential army that could defeat the Sardaukar. Stilgar was informed of this analysis in careful stages. He received it the way a man of experience receives intelligence that confirms something he had been too close to see clearly himself. He had known the Fremen were capable. He had known, in the concrete and personal way of a Naib who had led his siege through decades of survival and occasional combat, exactly what his people could do. What he had not had was the external reference point, the comparison against the Sardaukar specifically, that allowed him to translate his knowledge of Fremen capability into a language the Imperium would understand. Paul provided that reference point, and Stilgar, who had been cautious and watchful toward the off-worlder who had arrived in his desert talking about alliances, became something more interested and more committed. The relationship between Paul and Chani, in the context of the saga's larger themes, carries a weight that goes beyond its narrative importance. They are the emotional center of the first 3 books. Their relationship is the one piece of the story that operates almost entirely outside the political and religious and ecological frameworks that dominate everything else. And its tragedy is not simply that Chani dies. Its tragedy is that she was always the most honest person in Paul's life, and her honesty could not change the outcome. Chani was not impressed by Paul's prescience. She was Fremen, and the Fremen relationship with Sayadina, with people who could access the spice visions and sometimes see the shape of things to come, was practical rather than reverent. Prescience was a tool, a useful one, not a mark of divine designation. She had grown up with a father who was simultaneously a prophet to his people and a scientist to himself, and she had watched him hold both of those roles with a kind of self-aware irony that prevented either from becoming absolute. She brought the same clear-eyed pragmatism. She saw him as a man who could do remarkable things and who was making choices she sometimes agreed with and sometimes did not. She told him when she thought he was wrong. He listened most of the time. He could not always act on what she said, because the prescient vision constrained him in ways she could not fully see from outside it. But he valued it was, in the closed world of the imperial court and the Fremen Sietch and the palace on Arrakis, the one form of completely honest communication he could reliably receive. Her death in Dune Messiah is the moment when the prescient trap closes completely around Paul. He had seen it coming. He had tried, in the privacy of his prescient consultations, to find the thread that led past it. He had not found one. The death was in every path. And so he had lived for years with the specific grief of knowing exactly what was going to happen and being unable to prevent it, which is a grief that has no adequate description, because it combines the future pain of loss with the present pain of anticipation into something that exists outside ordinary human experience of grief's timing. He grieved before she was gone, and when she was gone, the grief that was supposed to be fresh was instead the completion of a process that had been happening for years, the settling of something that had been held suspended, and the release of the prescient future tether that had anchored him to the path he was walking. He was then finally free to walk into the desert, free to choose in the way that genuine choice requires, which is without the full foreknowledge of what the choice will produce. He walked into the open erg and into the tradition of the blind seer and into an existence that was, by any measure of the word, reduced. He had been the most powerful person. He became a blind, wandering preacher on the desert world where he had built that power. He lost the crown and kept only the thing he had carried into the desert the first time, the name the Fremen had given him and the training his mother had given him, and the discipline of the litany. Fear is the mind killer. The rest was sand. And across the years of the he did the most important thing he could have done, which was to say clearly what was true. The religion in his name was a corruption. The greening of Arrakis was a death sentence. The empire he had built was built on the same foundation as all previous empires, the willingness of people to transfer their judgment to a figure they believed could see what they could not. He said these things in the open market of the city his father had loved, and that the Harkonnens had held, and that he had taken back. He said them to people who mostly wanted him to stop saying them. He kept saying them. He was killed for saying them. He died as he had lived since the walk into the desert, which was to say in full honesty. Without the tools that power provides for softening what you actually believe into what your audience wants to hear. His son, watching this, understood what it cost and chose it anyway. The golden path required the willingness to pay the price that Paul could not pay, and Leto II paid it because he could see, more clearly than Paul had been able to, what not paying it would eventually cost everyone else. This is the relay that the saga runs. Each generation sees further than the last, at the cost of everything the last generation held dear, and pays the cost of seeing further, and hands the result of paying it to the next generation, who will see further still, at further cost. The accumulated price across the full sweep of the saga is staggering. Duke Leto's life, Jessica's obedience to the sisterhood, Paul's freedom, Chani's life and Paul's sight and Paul's humanity and Paul's remaining years. Aaliyah's sanity and survival, Leto II's body and his relationships and his 3,500 years of isolation, the Fremen culture, which the god emperor preserved in form while slowly draining of its original substance, the sandworms of Arrakis, 61 billion people in the jihad, Arrakis itself, Miles Teg, Dawi Odrade. The list continues. The golden path was paved with everything that was worth paying, by people who chose to pay it rather than survive comfortably into a future where the bill came due for everyone. There is no argument, in the end, that this was easy or that it was clean. Herbert did not make it easy or clean because he was not writing fable. He was writing the kind of fiction that insists on full accounting. Every decision in the saga carries its cost. Every cost is paid. The golden threads woven through the tapestry of 10,000 years of terrible history are exactly that, golden, and the gold is real. And the beauty of the thing that the golden path produces is genuine. But you can see, if you look, what the golden threads were woven from. They were woven from everything else. The desert on Chapter House grows, the worm breathes, the species scatters. The universe remains, as it always has been, larger than any single plan for it, and older than any single species, and patient beyond all reckoning. The humans move through it, trailing their history, carrying their dead, and trying, as they have always tried, to navigate toward a future their children will be glad to inherit. This is the complete history of Dune. 6 books. 10,000 years. One argument about what it costs to remain human across the scale of time that matters for a species rather than for an individual. The argument is complete, even without the 7th novel. The argument was always complete. It was complete from the moment the first page of the first book described a planet that smelled of cinnamon, and something beneath cinnamon, something older and stranger and more fundamental than any single civilization's claims on it. The planet was there before the Imperium. The planet will be there after the Imperium's last successor has dissolved. And in the deep places of the planet, where the sunlight does not reach and the off-worlder cannot survive, and the machinery of extraction cannot follow, the ecology that produces the spice will continue its ancient cycles, patient as geology, indifferent as time, alive with a purpose that no human institution has ever successfully redirected toward anything except its own eventual ruin. The Fremen had a phrase for this quality. They said, "The desert keeps what the desert takes." They meant it literally, about the physical things the sand consumed. They meant it also about the deeper truth that the desert embodied for them, which was that there are systems older and larger than any human arrangement of them, and those systems have their own continuity that outlasts the continuity of anything imposed on top of them. The Imperium was imposed on top of the desert endured, the jihad swept across the universe carrying Paul's name. The desert continued its ecological processes. The God Emperor ruled for 35 centuries. The desert accepted the God Emperor's body when it was offered, and incorporated it into the sand trout cycle, and continued. The honoured Matras burned Arrakis. The desert would grow again somewhere else. The humans moved through the world's indifference and built their civilizations in its margins, and called the margins the centre, and forgot that the centre was somewhere else, deeper and older and less interested in their ambitions than they required it to be. The desert kept what the desert took. The spice rose, the worm turned. And in the dark beyond the last chart, in the space where the species had scattered itself too widely to be found, the future was genuinely open for the first time in 10,000 years. That is where the story leaves us. In the genuine open, where no oracle can look, where the fear has gone and there is nothing, where the only thing remaining is the species itself, scattered and strange and invisible and alive, where the history of Dune ends, not with a period, but with the specific, fragile, irrevocable freedom of a question no one can answer for us, because no one can see what we will do with it. Only we will remain. Only we will choose. And the desert, patient as it has always been, will accept whatever we choose.